I want to try something a little bit different. Let me know what you think about this after. Leave a comment, the normal things. Tweet me at RealCreepSin. Let me know what you think about this. We're going to be looking at 4 separate creepypastas that I'll be narrating. A little bit of a compilation, I guess. So let me know what you think. White with Red. Original author, unknown. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him a key and told him that on the way up to his room, there's a door with no number that was locked and no one was allowed in there. She explained that it was a storeroom and it was out of bounds. She reminded him of this several times before allowing him upstairs. So he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight up to his room and going to bed. However, the instance of the woman had piqued his curiosity, so the next night he walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. So he bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, much like his own. In the corner was a woman whose skin was incredibly pale. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. Was this a celebrity? The owner's daughter? He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. As he was looking, the woman turned sharply and he jumped back from the door. Hoping she wouldn't suspect he had been spying on her, he crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door to look through the open keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything besides the distinct red color, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying on them the night before, and had blocked the keyhole with something red. He felt embarrassed that he had made the woman so uncomfortable, and he hoped that she hadn't made a complaint to the woman at the front desk. At this point, he decided to consult her for more information. After some gentle quizzing and the promise that an explanation would go no further than him, she finally broke down and said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story of what happened in that room. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in there, and we find that even now people get uncomfortable staying in there. But these people weren't ordinary. They were white all over, all white, except for their eyes, which were red." The statue. A few years ago, a mother and father decided they needed a break, so they wanted to head out for a night on the town. They called their most trusted babysitter. When the babysitter arrived, the 2 children were already fast asleep in their beds. So the babysitter just had to sit around and make sure everything was okay with the children. Later that night, the babysitter got bored and went to watch TV, but she couldn't go downstairs to watch it because they didn't have cable downstairs. The parents didn't want their kids watching too much garbage. So she called them to ask if she could watch it in their parents' bedroom. Of course, the parents said it was okay. But the babysitter had one final request. She asked if she could cover up the statue of the angel outside the bedroom with a blanket or a cloth, because it made her nervous. The phone line went silent for a moment. The father who had been talking to the babysitter said, "Take the children and get out of the house, now. We'll call the police. We don't own an angel statue." The police found both of the children and the babysitter slumped in pools of their own blood, within 3 minutes of the call. No statue was ever found. Where the bad kids go. I must have been 6 or 7 when I lived in Lebanon. The country was just ravaged by war at the time, and murders were common and frequent. I remember during a particularly vicious era, when the bombings rarely stopped, I would stay at home sitting in front of my television watching a very, very strange show. It was a kid's show that lasted about 30 minutes and contained very strange images, sinister images. To this day, I believe it was a thinly veiled attempt on the part of the media to use scare tactics to keep kids in place, because the moral of every episode revolved around very uptight ideologies. Stuff like, bad kids stay up late, bad kids have their hands under the covers when they sleep, bad kids steal food from the refrigerator at night. It was very weird to say the least, and in Arabic to top it all off. I didn't understand much of it, but for the most part, the images were very graphic and comprehensive. The thing that stuck out to me the most, however, was the closing scene. It remained for much of the episode. The camera would zoom in on an old, rusted, closed door. As it got closer to the door, strange and sometimes even agonizing screams would become more audible. It was extremely frightening, especially for children's programming. Then text would appear on screen in Arabic reading, "That's where the bad kids go." Eventually, both the images and the sound would just fade out, and that would be the end of an episode. About 15 or 16 years later, I became a journalistic photographer. The show had been in my mind my whole life, popping up in thoughts sporadically. Eventually, I had enough and decided to do some research. I finally managed to uncover the location of the studio where the channel's programming had been recorded. Upon further research, and eventually traveling to the site, I found it was now desolate and had been abandoned after the war ended. I entered the building with my camera. It was burnt out from the inside. Either a fire had broken out, or someone wanted to incinerate all of the wooden furniture. After a few hours of cautiously making my way into the studio and snapping pictures, I found an isolated, out-of-the-way room. After having to break through a few old locks and managing to break the heavy door open, I remained frozen in the doorway for several long minutes. Traces of blood and feces and tiny bone fragments lay scattered across the floor. It was a small room, and an extremely morbid scene. What truly frightened me, though, what made me turn away and never want to come back, was the bolted caged microphone hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the room. The Grifter. The Grifter is an alleged video that was first mentioned somewhere on 4chan's X image board. Watching it is said to be a soul-rendering experience, far more horrible than anything one could imagine. The image on the right contains screenshots of some of the scenes in the video. The few who have watched it are said to have been killed in their own homes. Only one thing in common: a strange doll hidden somewhere in the house. There is a message by the end of the video in the constructed international auxiliary language Esperanto. It says, "This child, now a young man, is still alive and lives in a local shelter, whose name was not given. He never spoke, and he is still catatonic." Anomalous Weather by William C. The alarm began early in the morning for you. Your mother and father gathered around the television with you as the blaring beep sprung out. The robot voice holds ultimate authority now. This is a severe weather alert being broadcasted at the request of the National Weather Service. At approximately 0700 hours CST, an unusual tropical storm is located 900 miles off the east coast of the United States. The storm is unusual as it appears to be made up of canine appendages, tissues, and is rapidly approaching inland with significant turbulence. All residents are advised to stay inside and barricade doors and windows if unable to evacuate within the next 4 hours. The storm speed has considerable force, and damage inflicted on the raining dog parts have already been reported as far as Maine, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Do not approach projectiles while they're still animate. Do not attempt to chase down runaway pets. A little confused, your parents look out the window. You live in Chicago, and indeed turbulent rain began to pelt the asphalt. But what is this about dogs? What does this have to do with anything? This is a continuous weather service alert being broadcast at the request of the National Weather Service. At approximately 0740 hours CST, the irregular tropical storm breached inland. The eye of the storm is currently above Pennsylvania, with turbulence exceeding as far as Chicago and South Carolina. Insulation of all openings, including doors, windows, and leading into your home, is recommended. Citizens owning any domestic canines are urgently requested to leave them outside. Do not let them in. Ignore any and all vocalizations, intelligible or otherwise. Your blood starts to turn cold. Is this a sick joke? It has to be. Someone must have hijacked the broadcast. During a storm, of all things. What fucking nerve. You don't quite notice it yet that the sky outside is darkened and has turned a mushy shade of red. Somewhere down the street, a woman faintly shrieks. The rain is getting heavier. This is a continuous, severe weather alert being broadcast at the request of the National Weather Service. This broadcast will continue until all severely anomalous weather has ceased. Isolate all domestic canines. Do not let them in. Seal every crack leading to the inside. Ignore all vocalizations from outside until the storm has passed. If possible, send your loved ones to the lower level of your home. Do not leave your home. Do not leave your home. Do not leave your home. Thick, heavy impacts can be heard from outside. Cautiously, your father goes to open the front door window for a crack and see how it is. As he does, you watch in absolute horror as a grimy red paw somehow worms its way underneath the door. It's muddy and viscous, and bone shines from underneath the fur. The scratching and howling that accompanies it is unbearable. It's impossible. The Smiling Man by Blue Title. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite, but that all changed after a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways away from the apartment. It was a quiet night, even for the weekend, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street to loop back to my apartment. That's when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street on my side was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance too, similar to a waltz. But he finished each box with a forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding that he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him a majority of the sidewalk to pass by me. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and he was wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off into the sky. His mouth formed a painfully wide cartoon smile. Between his eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street just before he could dance any closer to me. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped, dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing too, and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skywards, smile still on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I put about half a block between us, I turned away for a moment to watch a sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where the man had been standing, and he was gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I saw him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he moved fast. I was so shocked by this that I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving towards me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoe steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran or I pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or did anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept towards me. And then he stopped, about a car length away from me, still smiling his creepy smile, still just looking at the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. But what came out was just a whimper. What? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back on him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough to almost be out of sight. Then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I just watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. This time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side street and back onto a better lit road with some sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of my way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see that fucking smile. But he was never there. I lived in that city for about 6 months after that night. I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. Subway Stare. Original author, unknown. A woman was sitting on the subway late one night, and she noticed the woman sitting across from her was staring intently at her. She pretended not to notice, but each time she glanced at the woman, the staring continued. At one of the stops, a new passenger got on and sat next to her. After a couple of minutes, he quietly told her that he thought that she should get off at the next stop, knowing that the next stop was a bit of a busy one. She agreed. When the stop came up, she left the train with the man. The man then said to her, Thank God. I didn't mean to scare you, but you had to get off that train. The woman sitting opposite you was dead, and the two men on either side of her, they were propping her up. The Fourth Floor. Original author, unknown. In the apartment complex where I now live, there's a story about a girl who lived in one of the buildings. She lived on the 7th floor and used to come home late, because she was always working on her thesis and school was a bit far from her place. The story goes, every time she would take the elevator, it would stall on the 4th floor. The sliding doors wouldn't open or anything, but there would just be this feeling of pressure on the elevator, as if someone was going to step in and join her. Do you know the feeling of having someone stand next to you and stare at you, even though you couldn't see them? Apparently, this would happen to her each time. In fact, it got so bad one particular night. She asked her mother if she could go wait in the lobby for her and accompany her upstairs. Her mother, of course, agreed. The girl arrived home a little bit later than usual, like around 3 a.m. Thankfully, her mother was still in the lobby, waiting for her just like she promised. They entered the elevator together, and when the elevator paused on the 4th floor, the girl gave her mother a look and said, "See what I mean? It always happens." The older woman, in an effort to comfort her daughter, wrapped an arm around her shoulder and leaned in, right before whispering, "Do I really look like your mother?" The next day, they found the girl in the elevator, alone. She was dead. There were no marks on her body, and on her face was a look of pure horror. I'm a 911 operator, and I just had the most terrifying call. By Higgs Thunder. 911, what's your emergency?
Yeah, hi, this is gonna sound kinda strange, but there's a man stumbling around in circles in my front yard.
Could you repeat that, sir?
He looks sick or lost or drunk or something. I just woke up to get a glass of water and I heard the snow crunching around underneath my front window. So I peeked out. I'm looking at him now. He's about 10 yards away from my window. Something's definitely not right.
What's your address, sir?
1617 Quarry Lane in Pinella Pass.
I'm gonna send a squad car your way, but that's quite a ways out. Are you alone in the house, sir?
Yeah, I'm alone.
Can you confirm that all your doors and windows are locked? I want you to stay on the phone with me.
Yeah, I know my front door is definitely locked, but I'll go check the back door real quick. I really appreciate your help, by the way. I know this is kind of strange, but I really hope that...
Sir? Sir, are you still there?
He's still in the yard, but he's... What the fuck? He's upside down.
Sir, stay with me now. What's happening?
He's staring right at me, but he's standing on his hands now. He's perfectly still, just staring at me. He's doing a handstand and smiling at me. He's not moving.
He's doing a handstand, sir?
I don't know. Yeah, he's facing me, standing on his hands. He's got this huge smile and he's perfectly still. What the fuck? Please get someone out here now.
Sir, I need you to remain calm. I've put the call in and there's an officer on the way.
Oh my god, his teeth are huge. What the fuck? Please help me.
Sir, I want you to try and keep an eye on him, but make sure your back door is locked again. We need to make sure all access points are secure. Can you talk me through to confirm that your door is locked?
Okay, I'm walking backwards now, keeping him in sight. My hand is on the doorknob now. It's locked. I need to check the deadbolt, so I'm gonna take my eyes off him for a split second.
Alright, sir. Help is on the way. Just stay on the phone with me. Everything's gonna be alright. Sir? Sir? Sir, are you still there?
his face. It's up against the glass.
Sir, I need you to speak up. What's happening?
I looked away for a split second, and now his face that's pressed up against my front window. His teeth are huge and he's still smiling. There's no color in his eyes. Jesus Christ, please help me. Why won't it fucking just move?
Sir, I need you to go into the nearest room and lock yourself inside of it. Do you have a basement or a bedroom that you can lock yourself in?
He won't stop staring. He's gonna hurt me.
Sir, I need you to listen to me. Lock yourself somewhere safe until officers arrive at your house. Can you hear me?
Yes. I'm gonna lock myself in my room.
Are you positive you're alone in the house, correct?
Yes, I'm definitely alone in the house. Wait a minute. He's moving. He's shaking his head. He's telling me no. I think he can hear us. He's telling me I'm not alone.
Sir? Sir, are you still there? I heard a loud noise. Is everything all right? Sir? Alright, this is a very urgent update, so I'll get right to it. I pulled some strings with my colleagues in the department, and I was able to obtain a copy of the police report that the officer filed in regards to the call I got 2 weeks ago. I've got to be extremely careful about covering up the officer's personal information. The investigation is still ongoing, and there's been some weird stuff happening. You'll see what I mean below. The police and news department are in a frenzy trying to keep the details quiet, for now. And there's a palpable feeling of uneasiness circulating around the town. If my bosses find out that I'm posting this here, I lose my job. So be it. This is the only official statement being released to the public tomorrow morning. The Ashland Police Department advises all homes and businesses within a 5-mile radius of 1617 Quarry Lane, Pinella Pass, to secure all doors and windows and by any extra security measures available, effective immediately. A curfew is in effect for all citizens in and around the city of Ashland. All persons found on the streets after sundown will be held in questions in regard to any suspicious activity. A police barrier has been placed around the perimeter of the quarry in northwest Ashland. No one is allowed to enter this restricted zone until further notice. Any and all persons found attempting to enter this restricted zone will be subdued on sight. Officers have been ordered to use force at their own discretion. There will be no exceptions. And here is the transcript of the actual police report filed by the officer that arrived on the scene. I don't know how my friend got a copy of this, and honestly, I don't want to know. Begin report. Officer number approached the premises of 1617 Pinella Pass at 4:37 a.m. on February 9th, 2015, in response to a 911 dispatch report of a suspicious person. The officer immediately noted that there were no lights on in the house, and there was also no response after the officer repeatedly knocked on the door, trying to identify himself. Officer number then noted a series of erratic footprints and handprints in the snow leading up to the home's bay window. Officer number noted no evidence of forced entry into the home or through the bay window. Upon examining the rear of the house, Officer number noted another set of footprints leading from the edge of the quarry, approximately 20 yards from the house, leading directly towards the back of the home. The prints were spaced extraordinarily far apart, indicating that the individual was able to cover an immense amount of ground in relatively few strides. The officer then noticed a series of marks, presumed to be hand and footprints, leading directly up the aluminum siding of the house, ending immediately under the third-floor attic window. The officers then noted that the attic window appeared to have been broken from the outside. There were no ladders or cable visible to have assisted the invader in reaching the third story. Author's note: on the copy of the report I have, the sergeant of our department circled this section and wrote in the margin, "What the hell? Investigation and verification needed immediately." Upon completion of the officer's survey, and his inability to enter the home without a lawful warrant, Officer number began slowly driving away in his squad car at approximately 4:43 a.m. He was calling the station to report his findings. He claims to have witnessed several pale, smiling faces in every window of the house, each wearing an expression that he later described as eager and amused curiosity. End report. As I said, the city issued curfews and information about the restricted zones will be announced tomorrow, but I thought I would alert everyone here first. As far as I know, the exact detail about the report being held in confidentiality because, as you can see, there are some unsettling things surrounding this entire incident. Author's note: as I was uploading this information, another coworker friend of mine from the emergency dispatch staff called to inform me that the officer that was called to the scene has gone missing. You will definitely hear about that tomorrow. If you live anywhere near the area, police units from nearby counties are being brought on to assist with the search. I say this as a dispatcher. Please take these ordinances seriously and report any suspicious finding to the authorities. According to my friend, the officer's wife was the last person to have seen him. Apparently, he was leaving their home. He muttered something about wanting to check that house out again. Dumbwaiter. Original author, unknown. Our new house was an old house. We spent tons of money on renovations and upgrades before we could even live there. The basement was particularly heinous. After a while, it started to come around, looking less like a pit of despair from when we bought it to more of a man cave. Once everything was done, we finally moved in. One of the kids was poking around in her closet the other day, and she discovered an old dumbwaiter. I never knew we even had one of those. It led down into the basement, but apparently the compartment was bricked up before we even moved in. When setting up my man cave down there, I just plastered over the old brick like any other wall. My daughter was pretty disappointed when I told her I wasn't going to break down the wall and make the thing functional again. She wanted to send me little presents from her room while I was in the basement watching the game. Still though, she liked hanging out in her closets and pulling the thing up and down. I figured there were worse things that she could find interesting. During one of the worst snowstorms I can remember, we were all bored and stuck inside the house. The two girls were playing in their room while my wife and I were trying to read in the dim light coming in from the outside. The power had gone out about 3 hours earlier. Living in the middle of nowhere has its aesthetic perks, but definitely a trade-off to the luxury apartments. The kids were using the dumbwaiter, as always, sending one of their dolls up and down, making up a little story as they did it, and then they would rescue the doll. As they pulled it back up from the bowels of the house, I heard a little bump. Turns out one of the kids accidentally bottomed out in the basement. Then they pulled it back up. The youngest one screamed. I didn't even flinch. They were 4 and 7. They're always screaming. But then her sister started in and didn't stop. My wife and I ran up the stairs and the girls were backed up against the far side of the wall. They were wailing and crying. I tried to ask them what was wrong, but they were just inconsolable. The older one pointed at the closet. I went inside and looked. Inside the dumbwaiter compartment was their pet hamster. Only really, really messed up. Its eyes were completely removed from the sockets, and all of its guts were pushed out its backside. My wife tried to comfort the girls, and they'd at least stop screaming. They kept saying they never put the hamster in the elevator. That's what they called it. and he never left his cage. We didn't bother to chastise them for lying at that point. They were obviously way too upset. My mind was elsewhere, though. I was trying to figure out what the hell happened to the hamster. It was inside the compartment, so it couldn't have gotten crushed underneath when it dropped. It almost looked like the poor thing got put in a vice and then squeezed to death. We let the kids sleep in our room that night. The power was still out. My thoughts kept going to that hamster. There had to be a reason for it. I grabbed the flashlight beside my table and tiptoed over to the kids' sleeping bags and went in their room. The closet door was still open. I quietly worked the dumbwaiter up and down, and on the third trip down, I felt the rope shudder when I accidentally struck the bottom. I hoped it didn't wake anyone up. Very carefully, I pulled it back up. I thought it had gotten caught on something. It was heavier than it should have been. I gradually got it up to the top without making any more noise. Then I locked the braking handle and opened the door. The empty eye sockets of my younger daughter gaped at me as she stumbled out of the dumbwaiter, her entrails sliding out behind her. The Backrooms. Author unknown. It was approximately 12:15 when I entered the Johnson County Community Health Clinic. I was there for an appointment I had set up weeks ago. Just a routine checkup. This wasn't a new place for me. I've been here a couple of times before. However, the place had an odd nostalgic feeling to it, as if it were a location from my childhood or something. I could never pinpoint exactly why that feeling was, or where it came from. As I walked in, I had an overwhelming feeling of deja vu. The hum and the flickering of the fluorescent lights, the white tile flooring, and the muted beige paint on the walls. I noticed that there was a TV mounted in the corner, a smaller flat screen. It was playing a short PowerPoint slideshow loop of ads and events that were being held by the clinic. I passed the empty waiting room, a small area in the main room with magazines, children's playthings, and blue cushioned chairs. And I approached the woman sitting at the desk. She was sitting in her bluish-gray office chair, looking at its spreadsheet with some Windows XP desktop that they've had since 2008. There was a sign-in sheet on the corner in front of me. "I have an appointment with Dr. Priebus," I asked. "What time?" "12:30, I replied. She began typing something on her keyboard. "Ah, yes," she responded. "Gary Johnson?" "Mm-hmm." "Yes, I'll tell the doctor. Please, fill this out." She handed me a clipboard which held a simple fill-out form. I walked back to the waiting area, took a seat, and began to fill out the form. I was about halfway done filling out all my information when I slumped back in my chair. I hadn't gotten much sleep the night prior, and I was exhausted. As I slumped back, I noticed something peculiar. My head never hit the wall. In fact, it felt like it went in the wall. I got up quite frightened and looked at the wall. Nothing. Not a single hole or dent. Nothing had been made when my head hit the wall. So I reached out to touch the wall, and my fingers went through it. I recoiled in shock. "The hell was that?" I thought, as I reached out to touch the wall again, only to find my fingers clipping through once more. Then suddenly I lost balance and tripped, fell directly through the wall. I fell face first onto some dirty tan carpeting. Upon getting back up, I realized that I was in a completely different room. Well, not really a room, per se. More a set of rooms, all of which had connected openings. The walls were covered in gross tan patterned wallpaper. There was also an overwhelming stench of moist carpet. I turned back around and tried to put my hand back through the wall. It wouldn't go through. "Okay, what the fuck?" I muttered. I looked back into the rooms. There were no windows, no doors, nothing on the walls. Other than that disgusting wallpaper, of course. It was completely empty, aside from a single plastic blue school chair. At this point, the only thing going through my mind was fear, and the repeating thought of "I need to leave" on loop in my head. I started running towards the rooms, desperately trying to find an exit, but to no avail. There was no exit. Was this to be my permanent location until I died? No. There had to be a way out. I wasn't going to be just left here, right? Eventually, someone would notice that I was gone. But no one did. Then, eventually in the distance, I heard footsteps. But not those of a human. At least, not a normal human. Alongside the footsteps was a gurgling snarl, like that of an angry animal. I began to run. I ran as fast as I could from whatever the hell was approaching me. I didn't want anything to do with it. I ran for what seemed like forever, but I was always put back in the same room I started. At least, it looked like the same room. Not that I could really tell them apart. So I sat down, defeated. A feeling of dread filled my body, and I started to cry. I'm gonna die here. I'm still here. I haven't left. I've accepted my fate. In fact, I actually can hear footsteps. I wonder who it is. The Invasion. Original author, unknown. I worked at a regular office building. Some minor accounting firm for a large corporation. Nothing remarkable. It was good pay and within walking distance, so I wasn't complaining. After a long night of watching TV and drinking, I woke up to an explosion somewhere off in the distance at 2 a.m. I knew something bad was happening in the city. It seemed like every possible siren was blaring. I had an awful feeling deep in my stomach. I remembered dressing furiously and running out into the hall. I could hear dozens of people coming out from the streets screaming in terror, some in pain. Gunshots were ringing out everywhere. The very world seemed to be moving back and forth. I peeked out a hallway window, just enough to see outside. Hundreds of thousands of glowing orbs were moving across the sky, all in different directions. A steady flow seemed to be streaming upward out of a circular red aura. The aura seemed to be floating around a specific location off in the distance. I got down on my hands and knees and started crawling towards the staircase of the apartment building. I could smell death and smoke emanating from the street. All hell had broken loose down there. The explosions were climaxing. There was no pause between them anymore. I was completely alone and utterly terrified. After getting down the stairs and pushing open the emergency exit in the hallway, I stood up to see if it was clear through the small window. I could hear a man crying on the other side of the door, but he must have been just below my line of sight. I carefully reached for the door handle, but instead, I hit the door head first. I dazed in and out of consciousness. I could see muzzle flashes shining through the small window, up to the ceiling. When I woke up, it was still dark outside, but it felt like more than a day had passed. The world was much quieter now, except for some distant explosions. Only these sounded much further away. The ceiling was hit by some sort of vehicle, most likely a helicopter. The beam struck me directly as I was about to open the door. It got stuck on the wall before it could crush me. I crawled out of the rubble with very little problem, but my mind felt very numb. A small pool of blood formed where my head was laying, but after feeling around, I can confirm that most of the blood loss stopped during my rest. I crawled out of the alleyway, through a large hole left by the crash. My mind started to race. Part of it was telling me to be careful. Part of it telling me to find help as soon as possible. and another part was telling me to sit down and just give up. The alleyway was absolutely caked in blood. The sky was dark red, the same color as that aura. I seemed to be near the center of it. It expanded steadily outwards, in a slow but visible pace. Most of the blood had dried, yet there were still some fresh spots. I saw a few familiar faces in the corpses slumped up against the dumpster. I guess the entire apartment block had died in the alleyway. The smell was just overpowering, and the sight was absolutely numbing, and the silence around me was deafening. I peeked cautiously out onto the streets. Pools of blood filled every crater out there. There were even some organs floating in them, chunks of meat and bodies barely recognizable as human. All of this was strewn about. I stood in silence, looking at the pure carnage. The street was completely ruined. Rubble from the buildings and cars both blocked exits. Looking up, the only street lamp had a body hanging from it. I saw a single manhole cover between some wreckage, the upper half of a corpse and a crowbar laid next to it. Almost by instinct, I took it and started prying. I could hear movement somewhere off in front of me. I knew I wouldn't see a friendly face. I pried harder. The footsteps intensified. There was definitely more than one. I could hear inhuman gurgles coming from behind an overturned city bus. All of it was moving steadily towards me. Yet the manhole refused to budge. Then they came out. One at first, then a pair behind it, and then a crowd, all moving in my direction. The first one spotted me and hissed. Its red eyes locked onto me. The crowbar broke in half. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted with more power than I ever knew I had. I vaulted over an overturned Humvee, past piles of dead soldiers that those creatures had stacked near the machine gun nests. I heard an unearthly bull-sounding roar out of the darkness, directly to my right in a dark alleyway. I didn't slow down to see what made it. I ran towards my office. Nothing made sense anymore. The office seemed to be the only safe place. I passed right by the bloody elevators and went straight to the stairs. I charged upwards until I couldn't move my legs anymore. When those stopped, I crawled. I slid into an old janitor's closet next to the staircase. I pushed a few crates in front of the door and sat down. Then I just passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was daytime. After composing myself, I went outside and looked out one of the windows into the abyss that was once my home city. Entire skyscrapers were toppled like dominoes. Massive clouds of smoke rose from huge pits where the neighborhoods used to be. The few buildings that weren't on fire were ruined or completely destroyed. I could see the company's headquarters about 2 miles away. The steady stream of orbs was coming out of its center. What looked like millions of humanoid beings surged outwards from the building, slowly filling the surrounding streets. A dozen large creatures stood out from the crowd, steadily marching onwards. A helicopter lifted from the office roof, only to be swarmed by the orbs like some sort of bee. I turned my back as it crashed into another building. This world would never be the same. I found a dead guard with a pistol and a few magazines on him. I went back to the closet. That is where this story draws to a close. I have my gun trained on the door, the noises of those creatures emanating from down the staircase. I probably won't last very long, but I'm sure I'm going to take a few down as I go. It's funny. These 3 letters just repeat themselves in my head, over and over and over again. They were on our coffee mugs, our laptops, our pens. These 3 letters caused all of this, and I took part in it. They're even on the crate in front of the door blocking me in, displaying these 3 prominent letters proudly. U-A-C. Dead Bart by K.L. Simpson. You know how Fox has a very weird way of counting The Simpsons episodes? They refuse to count a couple of them, making the amount of episodes inconsistent. The reason for this is a lost episode from Season 1. Finding the details about this missing episode is difficult. No one who was working on the show at the time likes to talk about it. From what's been pieced together, the lost episode was written entirely by Matt Groening. During the production of the first season, Matt started to act strangely. He was very quiet. He seemed nervous and morbid. Mentioning this to anyone who was present would result in them getting very angry, and forbidding you from ever mentioning it to Matt. I first heard of this at an event where Dave Silverman was speaking. Someone in the crowd asked about the episode, and Silverman simply got up and left the stage. By doing that, he ended the presentation hours early. The episode's production number was 7G06. The title was Dead Bart. The episode labeled 7G06, Moaning Lisa, was made later and given Dead Bart's production code to hide the latter's existence. In addition to getting angry, asking anyone who is on the show about this will cause them to do everything they can to stop you from directly communicating with Matt Groening. At a fan event, I managed to follow him after he spoke to the crowd. Eventually, had a chance to talk to him alone when he was leaving the building. He didn't seem upset that I followed him. He probably expected a typical encounter with an obsessive fan. When I mentioned the lost episode, though, all the color drained from his face and he started trembling. When I asked him if he could tell me any details, he sounded like he was on the verge of tears. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote something on it, and then handed it to me. He begged me never to mention the episode again. The piece of paper had a website address on it. I'd rather not say what it was, for reasons you'll see in a second. I entered the address into my browser and came to a site that was completely black, with the exception of one line of yellow text, a download link. I clicked on it and a file started downloading. Once the file was downloaded, my computer went crazy. It was the worst virus I had ever seen. System restore didn't work. The entire computer had to be rebooted. Before this, though, I copied the file onto a CD. I tried to open it on a now empty computer, and as I suspected, there was an episode of The Simpsons on it. The episode started off like any other episode, but had very poor quality animation. If you've seen the original animation for some of the Enchanted Evening, it was similar, but less stable. The first act was pretty normal, but the characters acted a little off. Homer seemed angrier, Marge seemed depressed, Lisa seemed anxious, and Bart seemed to have a genuine anger and hatred for his parents. The episode was about the Simpsons going on a plane trip. Near the end of the first act, the plane was taking off and Bart was fooling around, as you'd expect. However, the plane was about 50 feet off the ground and Bart broke a window on the plane and was sucked out. At the beginning of the series, Matt had an idea that the animation style of The Simpsons would represent life, and that death could turn things more realistic. This was used in this episode. The picture of Bart's corpse was barely recognizable. They took full advantage of not having it move, and they made an almost photorealistic drawing of his dead body. Act 1 had ended with the shot of Bart's corpse. When Act 2 started, Homer, Marge, and Lisa were sitting at the table crying. The crying went on, and it got more pained and sounded more realistic. Better acting than you would think possible. The animation started to decay even more as they cried. You would hear murmuring in the background. The characters could barely be made out. They were stretching and blurring. They looked like deformed shadows with random bright lights thrown in on them. There were faces looking in the window, flashing in and out, so you could never really be sure what they looked like. The crying went on for all of Act 2. Act 3 opened with a title card saying 1 year had passed. Homer, Marge, and Lisa were all skeletally thin and still sitting at the table. There was no sign of Maggie or the pets. They decided to visit Bart's grave. Springfield was completely deserted. As they walked to the cemetery, the houses became more and more decrepit. They all looked abandoned. When they got to the grave, Bart's body was just lying in front of his tombstone, looking just the way it did at the end of Act 1. The whole family started to cry again. They eventually stopped and just stared at Bart's body. The camera zoomed in on Homer's face. According to the summaries, Homer tells a joke at this part, but it isn't audible in the version I saw. You can't tell what Homer's saying. The view zoomed out as the episode came to a close. The tombstones in the background had every Simpsons guest star on them. Some of them no one heard of in 1989. Some of them that haven't even been on the show yet. All of them had death dates on them. For guests who died since, like Michael Jackson and George Harrison, the dates were when they would die. The credits were completely silent and looked handwritten. The final image was the Simpsons on their family couch, like in the intros, but all drawn in the hyper-realistic, lifeless style of Bart's corpse. A thought occurred to me after seeing this episode for the first time. You could try to use the tombstones to predict the death of living Simpsons guest stars, but there's something odd about most of the ones who haven't died yet. All of their deaths, every single one of them, is listed as the same date. My Grandmother's Doll Just Licked Me by Doubledore Bastard. My grandmother died a few weeks back at the ripe old age of 85, passing away peacefully in her sleep. By all accounts, she lived a damn good life, and I tried my very best to make it so. Lord knows she did the same for me. This has been a difficult post for me to write. You see, when a treasured loved one dies, especially one that you grew up with, the little solar system of your life is thrown completely out of orbit. Not that mine was ever all that stable in the first place. My parents died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, and I was a little too young at the time to fully absorb the emotional impact of being orphaned. When the prospect of being put into the foster system was brought up by the family lawyer, my grandma took me in without a second thought. Her home was our home. It's where I built my childhood. Honestly, you'd never meet a more charitable woman than my grandma. From the second I came into her life, all the way up to her death, and even beyond, she provided for me without fail. Another interesting bit about Grandma is the fact that she was mute. I'm not talking selective mutism here. I'm talking full-blown, constant silence. I've known that woman for the entire 32 years of my life, and while I got used to it within a few months, to some, it seems crazy that I never heard a word from her. Of course, we had our own ways of communicating back then. I picked up sign language pretty quickly, as most kids tend to, and she used to write on this little chalkboard for me. I thought it was awfully cute at the time. I got a call from her lawyer a few days after she passed, telling me that she left her entire estate to me in the will. It doesn't matter how well you know a person. That kind of thing always hits you deep. Everything that wasn't covered by your donor card now belonged to me. About a week or two passed, some papers were signed, money exchanged hands, and the wheels of bureaucracy turned as slowly as ever. My grandma's possessions became my possessions, and some eager patients became the happy recipients of Grandma's remarkably healthy liver, kidneys, and lungs. Like I said, she was the giving type. The home was an old Georgian place, 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a well-maintained garden. I felt like a kid who just got a pony for Christmas. The problem was, I'm not a rich enough guy to pay the rent on the apartment and the house. And I'm not such a heartless bastard that I would immediately sell my childhood home either, especially on this bipolar market. I was talking to a good friend of mine over some drinks, and it was his idea that I convert it into a rental property. I mulled it over when I was sober, of course, but my office job wasn't going anywhere, so I decided that being a landlord might be a welcome change of pace. That's when things started to go downhill. I showed up at the house with all my supplies on Monday. My car full of paint, tools, and industrial-strength bin bags. It took me a few minutes to gather the strength to go in at first. This house has a lot of heavy history for me. Good times, bad times. Like I said, this is where I grew up, and Grandma's death had made the nostalgia all the more bitter to me. I kept telling myself, the faster I do it, the less it'll hurt. Like ripping off a band-aid. The place had barely changed since I moved out at 21. It kind of felt like a picture, frozen in time, waiting for my return. I guess I granted its wish in that sense. I just don't think it expected me to start tearing down the wallpaper. I was methodical, going from room to room, watching scenes from my childhood play out like a theater of the mind, before I started repainting and remodeling everything in sight. God, I forgot how ancient this place looked. Grandma's sense of style never really left the 70s. Once the first floor was bare, I dragged out all the old furniture onto the lawn. My drinking buddies were suspiciously absent when I needed help with the heavy lifting. I had a break for lunch, then I did some exploring. The rooms upstairs were exactly like I remembered. Grandma's room, and the bed she would never sleep in again, was laid out as neatly as ever. My room was just the same, covered in peeling Nirvana posters and bearing all the hallmarks of your garden variety 90s teenager. When I left home, I told her to turn it into a games room, or a quiet room where she could read her books. Just something that she would enjoy. I guess she never got around to it. Or she expected me to come back someday. Tears were just welling up in my eyes when I saw that old chalkboard she had laying on her bed, with "Welcome Home" smiley face written on it. The one room I hadn't checked was the attic. Back when I was a kid, I was never allowed to go up there. Grandma said, or rather wrote, that it was too dangerous, so I stayed downstairs whenever she occasionally made her pilgrimage up the hallway stairs. But Grandma's dead, and I'm an adult. I figured that if the attic was big enough, I could convert it into a loft room and take on another lodger. It would be more income if I was right, so it felt stupid to miss out on it. Flashlight in hand, I made my way up the stairs into the attic. The bulbs up there were long since fucked, so my only source of light was a thin shard emitted by the flashlight. I've never been a superstitious man, but something about that attic made me feel uneasy. Naturally, at first I didn't see anything but old boxes and suitcases. I made a mental note to check those later, while I forged deeper into this surprisingly spacious attic. My eyes were on the money, and the chances of being able to install a room up here were looking hopeful. Then, a shape caught the beam of my flashlight, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was shaped like a leg. Like a baby's leg. Like it had been ripped from the socket. I rushed over to take a closer look, and felt the greatest relief of my life when I realized that it was only plastic. Shortly after that, a second wave of creep set in. Because what was a plastic baby leg doing in my grandma's attic? I picked it up and swept the entire area with a flashlight, until I caught something familiar in the corner. That didn't make it any less weird, though. There were dolls. Hundreds of fucking dolls. Big, old, small, new, expensive, cheap, porcelain dolls to Barbie dolls, to American Girl dolls to Cabbage Patch dolls. Various sizes, shapes, materials, colors. I almost dropped the flashlight when I saw their dead eyes glaring at me, thinking my grandma was the next Rose West, until I realized that they were all fake. They were arranged in a big pile like some kind of shrine. Once my heartbeat normalized again, I took a few steps closer, letting my flashlight cut through all the gloom. So, my grandma had been collecting these for years, and she never wanted me to see them? Not a bad call, actually. They made me feel uncomfortable now. God knows what they would have done to me 20 years earlier. While I'm sure they had a lot of sentimental value to Grandma, they sure as hell didn't have any to me, and I figured that no lodgers would want to stay in a home that seemed like some sort of demented serial killer person-sized dollhouse. They had to go. All of them. I fetched a bin bag from the car and started packing up some of the smaller ones, just chipping away at Mount Creepy bit by bit. The way Grandma had stacked them didn't even leave them all visible. It was dolls on top of dolls on top of dolls, each one just as horrible as the last. All except one. I found her lurking underneath all the others, her face buried in the back of a tatty old rag doll. It was like she didn't want to be seen, or my grandma didn't want me to find her. She was bigger than the rest, about the size of a 4-year-old child, with slightly off proportions. Her little pinched-up face was molded from rubber and plastic. Her hair, long and black, looked like fiber optic tubing. It's one of those things that are difficult to put into words, but something about her just repulsed me. Maybe it was those vacant blue eyes or that little silk dress that reminded me of one of those post-mortem photographs they took of children in the Victorian era. It just felt eerie and wrong. Reaching out to touch her, the flashlight clenched between my teeth, felt like I was reaching out to grab a live tarantula. She was a lot heavier than I expected her to be. The torch glare revealed tiny scratches and imperfections in the plastic, making her look even uglier. Another thing I noticed when the light was shining directly on her face was that her mouth was closed. The rubber on her tiny, lifelike lips wasn't sealed, they just were closed. There was a black slit running between them. I have never felt as disgusted in my entire life as I did when I watched those little lips twitch, like something was moving behind her dead face. My initial thought was animatronics, like dolls that were designed to suckle on little bottles when you put them in their mouths. But this doll looked way too old for that kind of technology. So, being curious like a certain dead cat, I put my thumb on the doll's chin and gently slit open her mouth. In the darkness, something was shining. The doll had a tongue. A human tongue. Not a severed piece of flesh rotting away in there, but a moving, wiggling, salivating tongue. It came bulging out past the lips, writhing lazily before licking my thumb. It was hot and damp and stank of cigarettes. I screamed, dropping the flashlight to the ground, and hurled the doll at the wall. I bolted in the darkness on memory alone, knocking over boxes and leaping over suitcases, before tumbling down the stairs in a panic. I must have cleared the second floor faster than any human being alive, spraying straight through the door, not even looking back. The front door was left wide open, and the lawn was still covered in furniture, but I didn't care. The home was out of the way anyway, so if someone made the effort to come down here, they could take whatever they wanted. Fuck that doll, Fuck that house. I jammed my keys into the ignition and took off like a gunshot, leaving the neighborhood at 3 times the legal speed limit. It must sound crazy now, I know, but logic was the furthest thing from my mind. I tore away from my home at 80 miles an hour. I didn't feel safe until I was in my flat. The door slammed and locked behind me. I was hyperventilating for a little while. I threw up once and almost fainted twice. At the time, I tried to justify it, assuming that it must have been all the cheap fumes from the paint making me see things, making me kooky. I had been under so much stress lately. I had gotten so little sleep. It's no wonder I'm imagining such ridiculous things. Fear is exhausting. It takes a physical toll on you. Once the initial shockwaves had passed, I couldn't think about anything else but sleep. God, I was so tired. I could barely stand. Moments later, I collapsed onto my bed, fully clothed. I was asleep before I even knew it. Sleep wasn't much of a reprieve. I kept dreaming about that fucking doll, crawling all over my paralyzed body like a spider, dragging its warm, stinking tongue across my face. No matter how hard I tried, there was no pushing it from my mind. Its little blue eyes were branded into my thoughts. When I woke up the next morning, I felt like I had taken a 12-gauge blast to the face. My head throbbed, my skin burned. I just felt so itchy all over, like my bed had been swarmed by fire ants. Over time, the itches became more localized. When I realized I could feel it definitively on my forearm, I peeled back my sleeve to take a look. It was a patch of skin that had gone hard and smooth. And I mean rigid, like rock solid. It had almost a reflective quality to it, where the hair had somehow fallen out. The skin around it itched like hell, but when I went to touch the patch itself, I didn't feel anything. I found more of these patches on my body when I inspected myself in the bathroom mirror. These hard, reflective, feelingless patches. There was one on my inner thigh, one on my belly, 2 on my chest, and another on my left bicep. When I tried to peel one of the patches away, it just started bleeding. The patches weren't growing on my skin. The patches were my skin. The next day, I had an appointment with my GP about the issue. I stripped off in his office, letting him see the patches. A few more had grown on my legs since last time. And worst of all, he seemed equally baffled. I must admit, these are extraordinary circumstances, he said while trying and failing to cross-reference my symptoms against the known diseases on the medical database. I can't say I've personally seen anything like this before. Doctor, please, I pleaded with him, trying my best to stop myself from itching the patches. There has to be something you can do for me, something you can give me, like a pill or an ointment. He'd fallen silent, reading more small-type text on the screen. Well, I can book you an appointment with a dermatologist. Great. When's the soonest he can see me? Not until next week, I'm afraid. Next week? But doctor, I can't wait till next week. I'm afraid he doesn't have any appointments prior to Wednesday of next week. If you feel as though it escalates severely before then, contact A&E through the standard emergency number. And the hospital, they'll take care of you as best as they can. I'm sorry, but this is all I can offer. Things just got worse after that. I penciled in my date with the dermatologist onto my kitchen wall calendar. But my skin condition was just worsening. The patches were covering at least a third of my body by Wednesday. They'd grown on my arms, legs, ass, back, and chest, my stomach too. They were even starting to grow on my face. I couldn't even go into a well-lit room without the patches of my skin shining. It all came to a head Wednesday night, as I stood before the bathroom mirror. A patch of shiny, hard skin was beginning to grow on my cheek, making it hard to move my face. I picked at the ragged edges of the soft skin, wincing in pain while I did. until I noticed a piece of loose skin sticking out from my face, just on the edge of a patch. I grabbed it between my thumb and forefinger and started pulling. A long swath of translucent, soft skin peeled away from my face, revealing more rigid and reflective skin underneath. A few seconds later, I vomited into the bathroom sink. This is the last straw. It pushed me over the edge. The floodgates of rationality gave way to a maddening truth. It was that fucking doll. I had to put a stop to it. I had to know what the hell was going on with me. I got into the car with the kitchen knife slid into my belt and started driving towards my grandma's house. It was foggy out, low visibility, real horror movie weather. I was too angry to be afraid, too shocked to be uneasy. Soon there was going to be more of that awful plastic skin than there was real skin. I'd look like some perverse shop window mannequin. The furniture was still all over the front yard when I arrived. The front door was still wide open. Nothing had been touched. Frozen. A picture, just waiting for me. I have to do it fast, I thought. If I do it fast, it'll hurt less. Like ripping off a band-aid. Christ, what deja vu. I stormed through the front door and barged upstairs, knife in one hand and flashlight in the other. My footsteps slowed as I trudged through the second floor, then the attic stairs. The fear and trepidation were settling in. It felt palpable, as if it were squeezing me. Or maybe it was just my skin. The attic, like everything else, was the exact same as I left it. That bastard doll was still there too. I could see it faintly, its face to the ground, its body crumpled up in the corner where I threw it, where it belonged. I held the flashlight in my teeth again and headed over to the doll, remembering its bizarre weight. I grabbed it by the scruff of its dirty silk shirt and yanked it up into my arms. Once again, the harsh light was shining directly onto the doll's face. Oh dear God. The doll. It was covered in patches of skin. My skin. My soft, pink skin. Some of the patches were sporadic. Some were close together. But it was unmistakable. The doll was somehow growing new skin. Growing my skin. While the skin on my body turned to rigid plastic. I dropped the doll and stumbled backwards, the knife clinking on the floor and the flashlight rolling off, casting errant shadows on the wall. My skin was on fire again. My head was spinning. I vomited on the ground and clung against the wall, trying to steady myself in a world that just didn't make sense anymore. Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Resurrecting me from my trance, I pulled it out and answered with a trembling hand. Then I held it to my ear.
Hello, this is Dr. Samsa speaking. I know you don't know me, and I'm sorry to call you from home, but I'm one of the doctors who performed the post-mortem appendectomy on your grandma last week. I wasn't going to call, but something has been bothering me recently.
What? I replied in a monotone voice, barely in this world.
Your grandma, she was nonverbal, wasn't she?
Yeah?
When did she have the prosthetic fit?
This jogged me out of my haze. I'm sorry, what prosthetic? I don't follow.
Her prosthetic tongue, sir.
My blood ran cold. What?
Her prosthetic tongue. I wasn't even aware such a thing existed. In all honesty, it appeared to be polymer-based, but it was so perfectly fused with the tissue in her jaw, it didn't seem like any old replacement part. Perhaps she had some kind of bonding agent that was used as well?
I dropped the phone while the doctor just rambled on. He was wrong, of course, but he had given me the final piece of this whole insane puzzle. Yeah, it all made sense after that. When you touch the doll, it takes things from you. It took my grandmother's tongue a long time ago. Now, it's taking my skin. And I can't imagine that we were the first. There were some donors out there that made the doll that heavy. I walked from the attic, silent, almost catatonic, and sat in my car. I didn't move for quite some time, and the sideways glances I made towards the house, I could have sworn I saw the doll standing at the second-story window, staring down at me. But who knows? The mind plays tricks. Time is short. I'm running out of skin. Thankfully, my fingers have lasted this long, but I don't expect them to be here much longer. It's only a matter of time before I'm a prisoner of my skin. The doll's out there now, somewhere, just a leaf in the wind. And if that somewhere is near you, I hope to God you don't touch it. Because the last time I saw it, it still needed plenty of parts. No End House by Brian Russell. Let me start off by saying that Peter Terry was addicted to heroin. We were friends in college and continued to be after I graduated. Notice that I said I. He dropped out after 2 years of barely cutting it. After I moved out of the dorms into a smaller apartment, I didn't see Peter as much. We would talk online every now and then. AIM was king in the pre-Facebook years. But there was a period where he was not online for about 5 weeks straight. I wasn't worried. He was a pretty notorious flake and a drug addict, so I assumed that he'd just stopped caring. Then, one night, I saw him log on, and before I could initiate the conversation, he sent me a message. "David, man, we need to talk." That was when he told me about the No End House. It got its name because no one ever reached the final exit. The rules were pretty simple and cliche. Reach the final room of the building, and you win $500. There were 9 rooms in all. The house was located on the outside of the city, roughly 4 miles away from my house. Apparently, Peter had tried and failed. He was a heroin and a who-knows-what-the-fuck addict, so I figured the drugs got the best of him and he wigged out at a paper ghost or something. He told me it would be too much for anyone, that it was unnatural. I didn't believe him. I told him that I would go check it out the next night, and no matter how hard he tried to convince me otherwise, $500 sounded too good to be true. I had to go. I set out the following night. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something strange about the building. You ever see or read something that shouldn't be scary, but for some reason a chill crawls up your spine? I walked toward the building and that uneasy feeling only intensified as I opened the door. My heart slowed and I let out a sigh of relief as I entered. The room looked like a normal hotel lobby decorated for Halloween. The sign was posted in the place of a worker. It read, "Room 1, this way. 8 more follow. Reach the end and you win." I chuckled and made my way to the first door. The first area was almost laughable. The decor reminded me of a Halloween aisle at Kmart, complete with ghost sheets and animatronic zombies that gave a static glow when you walked by. At the far end, there was an exit. It was the only other door besides the one I entered through. I brushed through the fake spiders and headed towards the second room. I was greeted by fog as I opened up the door to room 2. The room definitely upped the ante in terms of technology. There was not only a fog machine, but a bat hung from the ceiling and flew in a circle. Scary. There seemed to have been a Halloween soundtrack that you would find at a 99-cent store on a loop somewhere. I didn't see a stereo, but I guess they probably had a PA system. I stepped over a few toy rats that wheeled around and walked with a puffed chest through to the next area. I reached for the doorknob and my heart sank to my knees. I didn't want to open that door. A feeling of dread hit me so hard that I could barely think. Logic overtook me after a few terrified moments, and I shook it off and entered the next room. Room 3 is where things began to change. On the surface, it looked like a normal room. There was a chair in the middle of a wood-paneled floor, a single lamp in the corner doing a poor job of lighting the area, casting a few shadows across the floors and the walls. There was a problem. Shadows. Plural. With the exception of the chair, there were others. I had barely walked in the door, and I was already terrified. It was at that moment that I knew something wasn't right. I didn't even think as I automatically tried to open up the door I just came through. It was locked from the other side. That set me off. Someone was locking the doors as I progressed. There was no way. I would have heard him. Was it a mechanical lock that set automatically? Maybe. But I was too scared to really think. I turned back to the room and the shadows were gone. The chair shadow remained though, but the others were gone. I slowly began to walk. I used to hallucinate when I was a kid, so I wrote off shadows as a figment of my imagination. I began to feel better as I made about the halfway point of the room. I looked down and took my steps, and that's when I saw it. Or didn't see it. My shadow wasn't there. I didn't even have time to scream. I ran as fast as I could to the other door and flung myself through without thinking of the room beyond. The fourth room was probably the most disturbing. As I closed the door, all the light seemed to be sucked out and put back into the previous room. I stood there, surrounded by darkness, not able to move. I'm not afraid of the dark, and never have been, but I was absolutely terrified. All sight had left me. I held my hand in front of my face, and I didn't even know what I was doing. I would have never been able to tell. Darkness doesn't describe it. I couldn't hear anything. It was dead silent. When you're in a soundproof room, you can still hear yourself breathing. You could hear yourself be alive, you know? I couldn't. I began to stumble forward for a few moments. My rapid heart beating was the only thing I could feel. There was no door in sight. I wasn't even sure there was one. The silence was then broken by a low hum. I felt something behind me. I spun around wildly, but I couldn't even see my own nose. I knew it was there, though. Regardless of how dark it was, I knew something was there. The hum grew louder, closer. It seemed to surround me, but I knew whatever was causing that noise was in front of me, inching closer. I took a step back. I've never felt that kind of fear. I can't really describe it. I wasn't even scared I was going to die. I was scared of what the alternative was. I was afraid of whatever this thing had in store for me. But then the lights flashed for just a second, and I saw it. Nothing. I saw nothing, and I know I saw nothing. The room was again plunged into darkness, and the hum became a wild screech. I screamed in protest. I couldn't listen to this goddamn sound for another minute. I ran backwards, away from the noise, and fumbled with a door handle. I turned and fell into room 5. Now, before I describe room 5, you have to understand something. I am not a drug addict. I have no history of drug abuse or any sort of psychosis, short of the childhood hallucinations I mentioned earlier. And those were only when I was really tired or just waking up. I entered the no-end house with a completely clear head. After falling in from the previous room, my view of the room was from my back, looking up at the ceiling. What I saw didn't scare me, it simply surprised me. Trees had grown into the room and towered above my head. The ceiling in this room was taller than the other ones, which made me think that this was the center of the house. I got up off the floor and dusted myself off, took a look around. It was definitely the biggest room of all of them. I couldn't even see the door from where I was. Various brush and trees had blocked my line of sight to the exit. Up to this point, I figured the rooms were gonna get scarier, but this was paradise compared to the last room. I also assumed that whatever was in room 4 stayed back there. I was incredibly wrong. As I made my way deeper and deeper into the room, I began to hear what one would hear if they were in a forest. Chirping bugs, the occasional flap of a bird's wings, seemed to be the only company I had in this room. That was the thing that bothered me the most. I heard bugs and other animals, but I didn't see any of them. I began to wonder how big this house was. From the outside, when I first walked up to it, it looked like just a regular house. It was definitely on the bigger side, but there was almost a full forest in here. The canopy even covered my view of the ceiling. But I assumed it was all still there, however high it was. I couldn't see any walls either. The only way I knew I was still inside was the floor. It matched the other rooms, the standard dark wood paneling. I kept walking, hoping that the next tree I passed would reveal a door. After a few moments of walking, I felt a mosquito fly on my arm. I shook it off and kept going. A second later, I felt about 10 more land on my skin in different places. I felt them crawl up and down my arms and legs. A few made their way across my face. I flailed wildly to get them off, but they just kept crawling. I looked down and let out a muffled scream, more of a whimper. To be honest, I didn't see a single bug. Not one single bug was on me, but I could feel them crawl. I heard them fly by my face and felt them sting my skin, but I couldn't see a single one. I dropped to the ground and began to roll wildly. I was desperate. I hated bugs, especially ones I couldn't see or touch. But these bugs could touch me, and they were everywhere. I began to crawl. I had no idea where I was going. The entrance was nowhere in sight, and I still hadn't even seen the exit. So I just crawled, my skin wriggling with the presence of these phantom bugs. After what seemed like hours, I finally found the door. I grabbed the nearest tree and propped myself up, aimlessly slapping my arms and legs to no avail. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My body was exhausted from the crawling and dealing with whatever was on me. I took a few shaky steps towards the door, grabbing each tree on the way for support. It was only a few feet away when I heard it, the low hum from before. It was coming from the next room, and it was deeper. I could almost feel it inside my body, like when you stand next to an amp at a concert. The feeling of the bugs on me lessened as the hum grew louder. I placed my hand on the doorknob. The bugs were completely gone, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I knew that if I would have let go, the bugs would return and there was no way I could make it back to room 4. I just stood there, my head pressed against the door marked 6th, and my hand shakily grasping the knob. The hum was so loud that I couldn't even hear myself think. There was nothing to do except move on. Room 6 was next, and room 6 was hell. I closed the door behind me, my eyes held shut and my ears ringing. The hum was surrounding me. As the door clicked into place, the humming was gone. I opened my eyes in surprise, and the door I had just shut was gone too. It was just a wall now. I looked around in shock. The room was identical to 3. Same chair, same lamp. But with the correct amount of shadows this time. The only real difference was there was no exit door, and the one I came through was gone. As I said before, I have no previous issues of mental instability, but at that moment, I fell into what I now know was insanity. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. First, I scratched, softly. The wall was tough, but I knew there was a door there somewhere. I just knew it was. I scratched at where the doorknob was. Then, I clawed the wall frantically with both hands, my nails being filed down to the skin against the wood. I silently fell to my knees. The only sound in the room, the incessant scratching against the wall. I knew it was there. I knew the door was there. I knew it was just there. I knew if I could just get past the wall. Are you alright? I jumped off the ground and spun in one motion. I leaned against the wall behind me, and I saw what it was that spoke to me. To this day, I regret ever turning around. There was a little girl. She was wearing a soft white dress down to her ankles. She had long blonde hair to the middle of her back, white skin and soft blue eyes. She was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. And I know that nothing in my life will ever be as unnerving as what I saw in her. While looking at her, I saw something else. Where she stood, I saw what looked like a man's body, only larger than normal and covered in hair. He was naked from head to toe, but his head was not human and his toes were hooves. It wasn't the devil, but at that moment, it might as well have been. The form had the head of a ram and the snout of a wolf. It was horrifying, and it was synonymous with the little girl in front of me. They were the same form. I can't really describe it, but I saw them at the same time. They shared the same spot in the room, but it was like looking in two separate dimensions. When I saw the girl, I saw the other form. And when I saw the form, I saw the girl. I couldn't speak. I could barely even see. My mind was just revolting in an attempt to process what this is. I had been scared before in my life, but I've never been more scared than when I was trapped in the 4th room. But that was the room before 6. I just stood there, staring at whatever it is that spoke to me. There was no exit. I was trapped in there with it. And then it spoke again. David, you should have listened. When it spoke, I heard the words of a little girl, but the other form spoke through my mind in a voice I won't attempt to describe. There was no other sound, just the voice kept repeating that sentence over and over and over in my mind, and I agreed. I didn't know what to do. I was slipping into madness, yet I couldn't take my eyes off of what was in front of me. I dropped to the floor. I thought I had passed out, but the room wouldn't let me. I just wanted it to end. I was on my side and my eyes were wide open, and the form was staring down at me. Scurrying across the floor in front of me was one battery-powered rat from the 2nd room. The house was toying with me, but for some reason, seeing that rat pulled me back from whatever depths I was headed, and I looked around the room. I was gonna get out of there. I was determined to get out of that house and live, and never think about this place again. I knew this room was hell, and I wasn't ready to take up residency. At first, it was just my eyes that moved. I searched the walls for any kind of opening. The room wasn't that big, so it didn't take long to soak up the entire layout. That demon still haunted me. The voice growing louder as the form stayed rooted where it stood. I placed my hand on the floor and lifted myself up, turned around to scan the wall behind me. Then I saw something I couldn't believe. The form was now right at my back, whispering into my mind how I shouldn't have come. I felt its breathing on the back of my neck, but I refused to turn around. A large rectangle was scratched into the wood. A small dent chipped away right at the center. Right in front of my eyes, I saw the large 7 that I mindlessly etched into the wall. I knew what it was. Room 7 was just beyond that wall, where room 5 was just moments ago. I don't know how I had done it. Maybe it was just my state of mind at the time, but I created the door. I knew I had. In my madness, I had scratched the wall that I needed most, an exit to the next room. Room 7 was close, and I know that demon was right behind me. But for some reason, it couldn't touch me. I closed my eyes and placed both hands on the large 7 in front of me. I pushed. I pushed as hard as I could. The demon was now screaming in my ear. It told me that I was never leaving. It told me that this was the end, but I wasn't going to die. I was going to live there in room 6. I wasn't. I pushed and screamed at the top of my lungs. I knew I was going to push through the wall eventually. I clenched my eyes shut and screamed. The demon was gone. I was left in silence. I turned around slowly and I was greeted by the room that was the same as one I had entered. Just a chair and a lamp. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't have time to dwell. I turned back to the 7 and jumped back slightly when I saw it was a door. It wasn't the one that I had scratched, but just a regular door with a large 7 on it. My whole body was shaking. It took me a while to turn the knob. I just stood there, staring at the door. I couldn't stay in room 6. There's no way. But if this was only room 6, I can't imagine what room 7 had in store. I must have stood there for an hour just staring at the 7. Finally, with a deep breath, I twisted the knob and opened up the door to room 7. I stumbled through the door, mentally exhausted and physically weak. The door behind me closed and I realized where I was. I was outside. Not outside like room 5, but actually outside. My eyes stung. I wanted to cry. I fell to my knees and tried, but I just couldn't. I was finally out of that hell. I didn't even care about the prize I was promised. I turned and saw the door that I just went through was the entrance. I walked to my car and drove home, thinking of how nice a hot shower sounded. I pulled up to my house. I felt uneasy. The joy of leaving the no-end house had faded, and dread was slowly building up in my stomach. I shook it off as a residual effect from the house and made my way to the front door. I entered and immediately went up to my room. There on my bed was my cat, Baskerville. He was the first living thing I'd seen all night. I reached out to pet him. He hissed and swiped at my hand. I recoiled in shock, as he never acted like that. I thought, whatever, he's just an old cat. I jumped in the shower and got ready for what I was expecting to be a sleepless night. After my shower, I went to the kitchen to make something to eat. I descended down the stairs and turned into the family room. What I saw is going to be burned into my mind forever. My parents were lying on the ground, naked and covered in blood. They were mutilated to near unidentifiable states. Their limbs were removed and placed next to their bodies. Their heads were placed on their chests facing me. The most unsettling part was their expressions. They were smiling, as though they were happy to see me. I vomited and sobbed right there in the family room. I didn't know what happened. They didn't even live with me at the time. I was a mess. Then, I saw it. A door that was never there before. A door with a large 8 scrawled on it in blood. I was still in the house. I was standing in my room, but I was still in room 7. The faces of my parents smiled wider as I realized this. They weren't my parents. They couldn't be. But they look exactly like them. The door marked 8 was across the room. behind the mutilated bodies in front of me. I knew I had to move on, but at that moment, I gave up. The smiling faces tore into my mind. They grounded me where I stood. I vomited again and nearly collapsed. That's when the hum returned. It was louder than ever, and it filled the house and shook the walls. The hum compelled me to walk. I began to walk slowly, making my way closer to the door and the bodies. I could barely stand, let alone walk. And the closer I got to my parents, the closer I came to suicide. The walls were now shaking so hard it seemed as though they were going to crumble. But still, the faces smiled at me. As I inched closer, their eyes followed me. I was now between the two bodies, a few feet away from the door. The dismembered hand crawled away across the carpet towards me. All the while, the faces continued to stare. New terror washed over me, and I walked faster. I didn't want to hear them speak. I didn't want the voices to match that of my parents. They began to open their mouths, and the hands were inches away from my feet. In a dash of desperation, I lunged myself at the door, threw it open, and slammed it behind me. Room 8. I was done. After what I had just experienced, I knew there wasn't anything else this fucking house could throw at me that I couldn't live through. There was nothing short of the fires of hell that I wasn't ready for. Unfortunately, I underestimated the abilities of the no-end house. And even more unfortunately, things got more disturbing, disgusting, more terrifying, and more unspeakable in room 8. I have trouble believing what I saw in the room. Again, the room was a carbon copy of 3 and 6, but sitting in the usually empty chair was a man. After a few seconds of disbelief, my mind finally accepted the fact that the man sitting in the chair was me. Not someone who looked like me, it was David Williams. I walked closer. I had to get a better look, even though I was sure of it. He looked up at me, and I noticed tears in his eyes. Please don't hurt me. What? I asked. Who are you? I'm not going to hurt you. Yes, you are. He was sobbing now. You're going to hurt me, and I don't want you to. He sat in the chair with his legs up and began rocking back and forth. It was actually pretty pathetic looking, especially since he was me, identical in every way. Listen, who are you? I was only just feet from my doppelganger. It was the weirdest experience yet, standing talking to myself. I wasn't scared, but I would be soon. Why are you? You're gonna hurt me. You're going to hurt me. If you want to leave, you're going to hurt me. Why are you saying this? Just calm down, alright? Let's figure this out and... Then I saw it. David was sitting down wearing the same clothes as me, except for a small red patch on his shirt embroidered with the number 9. You're gonna hurt me. You're gonna hurt me. Please don't. Please, you're gonna hurt me. My eyes didn't leave the small number on his chest. I knew exactly what it was. The first few doors were plain and simple, but after a while they got a little more ambiguous. The 7 was scratched into the wall, but with my own hands. 8 was marked in blood above the bodies of my parents. But 9? This number was on a person. A living person. Worse still, it was a person that looked exactly like me. David, I had to ask. Yes, you're gonna hurt me. You're gonna hurt me. He continued to sob and rock back and forth. He answered to David. He was me, right down to the voice. But that 9. I paced around for a few minutes while he sobbed in his chair. The room had no door, similarly to room 6. The door I came through was gone. For some reason, I assumed that scratching would get me nowhere this time. I studied the walls and the floor around the chair, sticking my head beneath and seeing if anything was below. Unfortunately, there was. Below the chair was a knife. Attached to it was a tag that read, "To David, from management." The feeling in my stomach as I read the tag was something sinister. I wanted to throw up, and the last thing I wanted to do was remove that knife from under that chair. The other David was still sobbing uncontrollably. My mind was spinning into an attic of unanswerable questions. Who put this here? How did they know my name? Not to mention the fact that as I knelt on the cold wood floor, I also sat on the chair, sobbing in protest of being hurt by myself. It was all too much to process. The house and the management had been playing with me this whole time. My thoughts, for some reason, turned to Peter, and whether or not he made it this far. If he did, if he met a Peter Terry sobbing in this very chair, rocking back and forth. I shook the thoughts from my head. They didn't matter. I took the knife from under the chair, and immediately the other David went quiet. "David," he said in my voice, "what do you think you're gonna do?" I lifted myself off the ground and clutched the knife in my hand. "I'm going to get out of here." David was sitting in the chair, though he was very calm now. He looked up at me with a slight grin. I couldn't tell if he was going to laugh or strangle me. Slowly, he got up from the chair and stood, facing me. It was uncanny. His height and every way he stood matched mine. I felt the rubber hilt of the knife in my hand as I gripped it tighter. I didn't know what I was planning on doing with it, but I had a feeling that I was going to need it. "Now," his voice was slightly deeper than my own, "I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you and I'm going to keep you here." I didn't respond. I just lunged and tackled him to the ground. I had mounted him and looked down, the knife poised and ready. He looked up at me, terrified. It was like I was looking in a mirror. Then, the hum returned. Low and distant, though I still felt it in my body. David looked up at me as I looked down at myself. The hum was getting louder, and I felt something inside me snap. With one motion, I slammed the knife into the patch on his chest and ripped down. Blackness fell on the room, and I was falling. The darkness around me was like nothing I had experienced up to this point. Room 4 was dark, but it didn't come close to this completely engulfing me. I wasn't even sure if I was falling after a while. I felt weightless and completely covered in the dark. Then a deep sadness came over me. I felt lost, depressed, and suicidal. The sight of my parents entered my mind. I knew it wasn't real, but I had seen it, and the mind has trouble differentiating between what is real and what isn't. The sadness only deepened. I was in room 9 for what seemed like days. The final room. And that's exactly what it was. The end. The no-end house had an end, and I reached it. At that moment, I gave up. I knew that I would be in that in-between state forever, accompanied by nothing but darkness. Not even the hum was there to keep me sane. I had lost all senses. I couldn't feel myself. I couldn't hear anything. Sight was completely useless here. I searched for a taste in my mouth and found nothing. I felt disembodied and completely lost. I knew where I was. This was hell. Room 9 was hell. Then it happened. A light. One of those stereotypical lights at the end of the tunnel. I felt the ground come up from below me, and I was standing. After a moment or two of gathering my thoughts and senses, I slowly walked towards the light. As I approached the light, it took form. It was a vertical slit down the side of an unmarked door. I slowly walked through the door and found myself where I started, in the lobby of the no-end house. It was exactly how I left it, still empty and still decorated with childish Halloween decorations. After everything that happened that night, I was still very wary of where I was. After a few moments of normalcy, I looked around the place trying to find something different. On the desk was a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on it. Immensely curious, yet still cautious, I mustered up the courage to open the envelope. Inside was a letter, again handwritten. David Williams, congratulations, you made it to the end of the no-end house. Please accept this prize as a token of your great achievement. Yours forever, Management. With the letter were 5 $100 bills. I couldn't stop laughing. I laughed for what seemed like hours. I laughed as I walked out to my car and laughed as I drove home. I laughed as I pulled into my driveway. I laughed as I opened the front door to my house and laughed as I saw a small number 10 etched into the wood. Item number, SCP-2006. Object Class, Keter. Special Containment Procedures. SCP-2006 is to be contained at Site-118 in an airtight containment cell. The entity must be constantly monitored for changes in forms, which are to be noted immediately. All personnel coming into contact with SCP-2006 are required to enroll in an acting course with a focus on expressing fear and surprise. Every month, SCP-2006 is to be shown at least one new extremely low-quality horror or science fiction movie containing horror elements. All interaction with SCP-2006 must confirm that the entity continues to believe that said works demonstrate a superb grasp of horror. Description: SCP-2006 is an anomalous spherical entity roughly 50 centimeters in diameter when it's in its default state. SCP-2006's stated goal is to cause feelings of fear and/or horror in as many humans as possible. To accomplish this purpose, SCP-2006 possesses the ability to change its shape, mass, volume, density, and chemical structure and the voice of any form it desires. Currently, there is no known way to damage SCP-2006. The extent of its shapeshifting abilities is unknown, and currently thought to be unlimited. Currently, SCP-2006 demonstrated a fondness for taking on the forms of various entities and villains from various horror and science fiction movies that it's witnessed. The most common form that SCP-2006 has taken is that of Roman, from the 1953 movie Robot Monster. SCP-2006 is capable of speaking even when it possesses the form of an entity that normally cannot speak. SCP-2006 will generally attempt to startle, scare any individual it comes in contact with, but after doing so, it will become affable and friendly. The reason behind this is currently unknown. Although SCP-2006 has repeatedly stated its goal of causing as much fear as possible, SCP-2006 is a poor judge of concept when it comes to fear in humans, and constantly searches for new methods in which to accomplish this goal. This poor recognition extends to recognition of emotions in humans, as SCP-2006 is incapable of distinguishing subtle differences between emotion that would be obvious to a human. Interview log, SCP-2006. Interviewer, Dr. Luif. Interviewed, SCP-2006. As Dr. Luif enters the room, SCP-2006 can be seen crouched near the door. SCP is in its Roman form. SCP-2006 proceeds to leap out of its crouched position, throwing its arms in the air.
Fear me, mortal. I am the mighty Roman. Cower in fear.
Dr. Luif screams and stumbles backwards, raising his hands in protection. Please, mighty Roman, don't hurt me.
It's just me. I got you pretty good, didn't I, Doc?
SCP-2006? Oh dear lord, you really frightened me there. I was about to have a heart attack.
That's what I do, Doc. Ha! Boom!
Dr. Layouf then stumbles backwards.
Heh, still got it. So, was there something you wanted to talk to me about, Doc?
Yes. I was wondering, why do you exactly feel the need to cause fear in others?
I don't understand the question.
That is, why do you scare people?
Oh, that's an easy one. I scare people because it's fun. And, you know, it's what I do. Just like you do that doctory stuff, I do scary stuff. I'm the best at it. I don't really see what else there is about it.
Yes, that you are. I'll take my leave then.
Come back around soon. I'll have some real scary stuff next time. By the way, I will eat your soul!
Oh god, someone let me out of here. I'm going to die of fright. Addendum. The current site director for Site 18 has issued the following memorandum regarding SCP-2006. I have been getting reports of some lax behavior regarding SCP-2006. Many personnel have been heard laughing at SCP-2006 during surveillance when it watches a new movie, or when it attempts to scare individuals. Some personnel have even been heard questioning why SCP-2006 is classified as a Keter entity. I am here to remind you that a Keter entity is a Keter entity, regardless of how innocuous it may seem. No, SCP-2006 is not a rampaging demigod or a regenerating super lizard. However, it possesses the same level of danger as any other Keter entity that the Foundation has contained. Think of SCP-2006's purpose. It wishes to scare people. Imagine what would happen if SCP-2006 broke containment and found out what really scared people. Imagine if it saw the horror and fear of war, or the concepts of paranoia or phobias that are common to each and every human being. Imagine if it found out the true horror of a nuclear holocaust or a KX-class scenario. Now, couple that with the entity being able to shapeshift and has no known limits. Then, you'll understand why it's classified as Keter. All personnel mentioned have been suitably disciplined. I do not want to hear about this again. Dr. Randall Owings, Site 118 Director. Squidward's Suicide. Original author, unknown. I want to start off by saying that if you want the answers at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios in the year 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't. But it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would shit themselves over it. Now, since I work directly with editors and animators, I get to view the new episodes before they're aired. I'll get right to it without giving any unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat zapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up the season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back several months. Me and 2 other interns were in the editing room, along with the lead animator and the sound editor for the final cut. We received the copy of what was supposed to be Fear of the Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that this isn't the final cut yet, animators often put up a mock card, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, sometimes lewd titles, such as How Sex Doesn't Work, instead of Rockabye Bivalve, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card, Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think more of it than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it. The happy-go-lucky music played as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. Bubbles splash across the screen and comes up with the ending of the Squidward's concert. Things start to seem a little bit off here. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, the sound is synced up with the animation, so yes, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a light murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing. That's common in the show. But you could hear clear malice in it. Squidward's in full frame and he looks visibly afraid. The shot then goes to the crowd, with SpongeBob in the center frame. He too is booing. Very much unlike SpongeBob. This isn't the oddest thing though. What was odd is everyone had hyper-realistic eyes, very detailed. Clearly not shot of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, and since we aren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children. Yet. The shot goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window is of the night sky, so it's not very long after the concert. The unsettling part at this is there's no sound. Literally no sound. Not even feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, but their status showed him working just fine. He just sat there, blinking, in silence for about 30 seconds. Then started to sob softly. He put his hands or tentacles over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. All the while, a sound was growing in the background, very slowly growing, from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze going through the forest. The screen slowly starts to zoom in on his face. And by slow I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10-second apart side by side. The sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen twitches a bit, as if it twists in on itself, for a split second then back to normal. The wind through the trees sound gets louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is the sound, and Squidward's sobbing sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes and the sound was coming from the other side. As good of a sound quality as the studio likes to have, they didn't purchase equipment that would be this good to produce this quality of sound. Below the sound of the wind and the sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so I had a hard time pinning it down. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had a hard time thinking about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently and something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused this and rewound frame by frame. What we saw was just horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. The face was mangled and bloody. One eye dangling over his upturned face, popped. He was naked down to his underwear. His stomach was crudely cut open, and his entrails were lying beside him. He was laying on some pavement. It was probably a road. The most upsetting part was the shadow of the photographer. There was no criminal tape, no evidence tags or markers. The angle was completely off for it to be shot as evidence. It would seem that the photographer was just some person responsible for the child's death. We were, of course, mortified, but pressing on, hoping it was some kind of sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before and half the body in frame. There now was what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eye. The blood was also done in hyper-realistic style, looking as if you touched it you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded as if it were that of a gale blowing through the forest. There was even the sound of snapping branches. The laughing, a deep baritone, lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen then twisted again and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant, to say the least, to go back. We all were, but he knew that he had to. This time, the photo is what have appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was popped out too, and popped, naked except for her underpants. Her entrails were also on top of her, above a crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on a street and the photographer's shadow was visible. Very similar in size and shape to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and the one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. We resumed the show. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all the sound, like it was when the scene started. He put his tentacles down and his eyes were done in the hyperrealism, like the others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and the most fear-inducing of all was that the sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back and so did the deep voice laughing. This time, the photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and back up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age, but this time the scene was different. The entrails were being pulled out of a stomach wound by a large hand, and the right eye was popped out and dangling, blood trickling down from it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next. Same thing. He went back to the first and played him quicker, and I lost it. I vomited right there on the floor. The animating and sound editors gasped at the screen. The 5 frames, they weren't 5 different photos. They were played out as if frames in a video. We all saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it, and we saw 2 frames of the kid blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call the creator to see this. Mr. Heelenberg arrived about 15 minutes later. He was confused as to why we called him down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming and all sound stopped again. Squidward just stared at the viewer, full frame of the face for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out and a deep voice said, "Do it." And we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatters all over the wall behind him, his bed, and his face flies back with force. The last 5 seconds of the episode was his body on the bed, on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg was obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us there to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it on my mind, and gave me horrible nightmares. I'm so sorry that I stayed. The only theory we could think of was that the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze what happened. The analysis of the file showed that it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we all began viewing it. All of the equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have glitched and showed us the wrong time. But everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified and no clues were gathered from the data or the physical clues in the photo. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before now, but now that I have had something happen to me that I can't prove beyond anecdotal evidence, I like to think twice about things. Shell Shock. Original author, unknown. My grandfather was a kind and generous man. He was the type of grandfather that would slip you a sweet or a biscuit after your parents had already said no, with a quick wink and a finger to his lip. The kind of old man who would roll up his sleeves and get stuck in helping your dad fix the car or put up shelves. Even well into his 80s. A slight stoop and a stock of white hair, and a deep, throaty laugh are the things that I will remember the most clearly about him. That, and his penchant for smartness. You never saw him without a shirt and tie, a sports jacket, or a suit, and braces rather than a belt holding up his trousers. Just occasionally, he would freeze up. I don't really remember when I first noticed it, and it was really bizarre. One minute, he'd be chatting away happily to mom or grandma, a mug of steaming tea in his hand, and the next, he would just stop, frozen in time, as his eyes just glazed over. Even more weirdly, the conversation would just continue to flow around him, as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, maybe even up to a half an hour, he'd unfreeze and then rejoin the conversation. His tea cold and forgotten. He drank a lot of cold cups of tea. I asked my mother about this once. She told me that sometimes Granddad froze up because of what he saw in the army, and it was a medical condition known as shell shock. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, but it seemed a suitable answer to my young, inquisitive mind, and I pursued it no further. Like many of his generation, he'd been to war. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember seeing his medals in a drawer, tarnished and gathering dust. And I wondered why he didn't take better care of them. Later I found out, like many young men, idealistic young men, he'd volunteered in the summer of 1914. He had been sent out to France as part of the new service battalion 2 years later, just in time for the Great Reaping of Souls, known as the Battle of Somme. I snuck in once, years later, and pulled out the medals so I could take a look at them. There were 3. A bronze star with 2 swords across it, a silver one, and a gold one. There was also a dull bronze strip, about 2 inches long but very, very thin. I wondered what the medals were for, and this was before the days of Google. I had to go down to the library and look it up. The librarian recommended a stuffy old tome, with dull black and white pictures. But it depicted quite clearly the medals that I had seen in my grandfather's drawer. According to the book, they were British war medals. The British Victory Medal and the 1914 Star, irreverently referred to as Pip, Squeak, and Wilfred. The standard campaign medals awarded to most British servicemen who served during 1914. I found myself slightly disappointed that they weren't issued for some heroic deed. But I still wonder why he just shoved them in a drawer and forgotten about them. Then I remembered the bronze strip. I flicked through the book in the hopes of finding an illustration, and sure enough, there was a picture of a similar strip. According to the book, this was a wound stripe, awarded to soldiers who suffered an injury in battle. Suddenly, it all made a lot more sense, and I realized why he didn't like to talk about it with us. It also made more sense as to why he would occasionally freeze up. I assumed it was just something to do with the wound. My curiosity satisfied, I left the matter alone and soon forgot all about it. That Christmas, because I was 16, my dad let me have a few drinks with dinner, and afterwards, the men sat around the table with a glass of port and a cigar. We told jokes and talked about world affairs and generally enjoyed ourselves. This was the first time I'd been invited to stay, and it really felt like a privilege, being treated like one of the men. My mother, grandmother, and aunts left to chat in the kitchen and wash up, whilst my sister and cousins went into the lounge to play with their new toys. We chatted, joked, swore, laughed. We were having a great time just being men. No wives or kids within earshot. I really felt like I was a part of something. Uncle Bob had finished telling a risque joke about a barmaid when Granddad spoke up. When I was in the war, we all turned to him, our laughter subsiding, prepared to listen to what he had to say. I learned that after a few drinks, he'd occasionally start reminiscing about his war days, but never when Grandma or any of the kids were around. They were usually just some of the pranks that they played on the sergeant, or about one drunken night on leave. This story, it wasn't like those. One night, the sergeant told us that we were going on a night raid. Usual business. Up over the parapet after dusk. Quick look at the enemy lines, maybe snatch a sentry for interrogation and unit identifications. The brass always wanted to know who we were facing, as if it were a new unit, or a reserve one that might be worth planning an attack. I got tooled up with the rest of the lads, rifles, bayonets, and some ammo in pockets only. None of our usual marching kit, as it might get snagged on a wire or make some kind of sound to give us away. I was the number one on the Lewis gun, a big, heavy bugger, far too unwieldy to take on a raid. So, I was carrying my Webley revolver and a trench club that I had made from hammering hobnails into an axe handle. The thought of this made me feel queasy. I've seen photos of trench clubs in a library book. Evil-looking blunt instruments with vicious spikes. It's difficult to contemplate how someone as kind and as gentle as my grandfather could have made one of these for the express purpose of breaking bones and caving in skulls. We went forward through the churned earth, past the corpses of Jerry's last attack. I remember my mate Harry slipped through some poor bugger's entrails. He swore under his breath. The sergeant gave him a proper dark look for making a noise. We all smiled about the bollocking he'd get when we got back to our lines. We were all shitting ourselves with fear. He always did when he went out on a raid, so anything seemed funny at that point. When you see your mates die every day, when a shell, a bullet, or a bomb could kill you at any moment, you learn to live with the fear. You get used to it. But stepping out into no man's land, that's another fear altogether. You feel naked, alone in the universe. It feels like every sniper in the German army is trying to get the beat on you, ready to blow your head off. It's more than enough to drive a man mad. All talk had ceased around the table at this point. Everyone was listening in, intrigued by my grandfather speaking. He didn't sound like an old man anymore. The passion in his voice had the clear tones of a younger man. He was staring into the middle of the distance as he spoke. He had frozen up earlier that day, when my sister had squealed when she received a new Bunty annual. His face was the same now, except for his mouth. It was moving as he spoke. This time was worse. We all felt it. A cold fog had rolled over no man's land, which any other time would seem as a blessing as it masked our movement from Jerry. But that night, it seemed ominous, malevolent. We kept moving forward. We couldn't see enemy lines through the fog, but we knew they were close. We kept low and slow. As we moved up, I began to see a shape emerge from the fog. The sergeant saw it too. He waved us down into a holding pattern. We all drew a bead on the shape. After a few moments, we got a nod and began to move up. As we got closer, we began to make out the shape of a man. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing alone, staring at us. I'm not prone to superstition, but that was bloody creepy. I looked at the sergeant, he nodded to me. Fuck, I thought. I've got to go investigate. I stepped closer and began to make out a little more. He was definitely in a Jerry uniform, one of the old ones with the spiked helmet still on his head. I began to make out the features on his face, and I could swear that the guy was smiling at me. I took another step and felt something shift under my feet. I nearly pissed myself. I dared not look down to see what it was, as I didn't want to take my eyes off of whatever was in front of me. Another step closer, gripping my weapon with white knuckles. I suddenly noticed it. I nearly laughed out loud as the tension drifted away. He was hanging up on the barbed wire, caught up in the entanglements and as dead as a doorknob. I heard the tales from one of the old sweats. Men would get so entangled in the wire when they died that the wire would keep them standing up. Feeling completely relieved, I carried on towards him in a giddy state. I figured that the helmet would make a good souvenir. After all, this poor bastard didn't need it anymore. As I grabbed the spike, the head fell back. He trailed away, and for a second, I thought he was having one of his moments. But then, he looked directly at me, focusing for the first time. I felt dread crawl up my spine. He didn't have any eyes, just two gaping holes, as if they had been ripped out by something, or someone. His mouth was twisted in a rictus grin, as if he was involved in some sort of macabre joke. I felt the courage of a moment before just drain out of me. I dropped the helmet, which clattered to the ground. I had seen a lot of bodies by this point, some of them close friends, but something about this one seemed different, just wrong. The feeling of being watched crept over me again, and I wondered if this was some new and evil trap those bastards had set up for us. I wanted to curl up in a ball and hide, but I couldn't let my mates down. I turned around to see where they were, but the fog was thicker now, and I couldn't see them anymore. I had to find them. I had to let the sergeant know what I'd seen. So I began making my way back towards them. I would look back occasionally, a sixth sense not wanting me to take my eyes away from the corpse behind me. By this point, Granddad was staring back into the middle of the distance again. I glanced at my father, but the look on his face told me that this was a tale he hadn't heard before, and all the color had drained from his face. I had moved about 20 yards when I realized I should have came across him by now. I looked back, but the corpse had disappeared back into the fog. I was alone. I assumed that the sergeant had decided to call off the raid. The fog had gotten worse, and that they had just left me behind. Anger at being abandoned overcame my fear by this point, so I strode forward, determined to get back to our lines. I saw a shape ahead of me and assumed it was the rear guard of the unit, so I doubled my pace, hoping to catch up to him. As I moved closer, I realized that he wasn't moving, and instead, he was hung up on wire. With a sigh of frustration, I assumed that I had gotten turned around in the fog, and somehow made me double back to the corpse I had seen earlier. I resolved to go grab the helmet, so at least I'd have something to show for this whole mess. But as I approached, I began to feel that same sense of deep unease that I had before. And as I got closer, I realized why I was feeling so uncomfortable. It was a different man. Same pose, same sightless grin, but this man wasn't the German that I had seen before. He was wearing a British uniform. I vomited right there. Not because he was dead, not because of the blood seeping from his eye sockets that was fresh, but because this wasn't just anybody. It was my friend, Harry. I felt sick. Harry had been on patrol with us. How could he be strung up in the wire like this? I tried to pull the fat, rusted strands of wire off of him, but all I succeeded in doing was tearing up my hands. My club and revolver were useless. I wish that I had wire cutters or even a knife. I fell at his feet, and I wept. I had no idea where our lines were in the fog, and I was helpless to do anything for my friend. As I laid there, tears streaming down my face, I heard a shrill scream which chilled me to the bone. I was frozen in place, terror overtaking all other feelings. I could have been there for minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. Then I heard the scream again, and this time, it triggered something in my brain. I just got up and ran. I didn't care anymore. I prefer a Jerry bullet to the brain than let whatever was out there catch me. It felt like I ran for hours, stumbling over shell holes and debris of no man's land. Eventually, I heard an English voice call out. I called back that I was a friend, and I stumbled into the front line trench. I was battered, bloodied, and worn from the wire and the debris that I had collided with on my run. But I had never felt so safe on the front line in all my life. I was the only man from my unit to ever return. Granddad paused for a moment, long enough that we all looked at each other wondering if the story was over. It had grown overcast outside. I could feel the cold in the dining room, despite the fire crackling in the grate. This pause lasted so long, I was desperate for someone to break the silence. Just as it looked like Uncle Bob would break the spell, Granddad spoke again. 2 weeks later, we mounted an attack on the same sector. I took a round in my shoulder in the confusion, and I laid in a shell hole for a day before the stretcher bearers found me. Apparently, I had lost a lot of blood, and was swimming in and out of consciousness. When I came to, I had a hole in my shoulder, a bit of brass to say that I was wounded in combat, and this. He pointed to a faded white scar above his left eye. Something had tried to gouge my eye out. I never forgot the story my grandfather told me about his night in no man's land, the horrors he witnessed there. He never spoke about it again. And although over the next few years, after a few drinks late in the winter evenings, Uncle Bob tried to ask him about it, he'd always refuse. Last time Uncle Bob asked, the room went silent and suddenly felt cold. Granddad's gaze just went dead, in the exact same way he would, and he would just freeze up. No, I don't want to talk about it. Please just don't ask me again. He said very quietly. The conversation was stilted for the rest of the evening, and eventually he left in an awkward silence. Nobody, not even Uncle Bob, ever asked him about it again. When I was 19, my grandpa passed away. I was a year into my university course, the first member of my family ever to go. I felt a weight of expectation on my shoulders, especially from my granddad, who was just over the moon when I told him that I had been accepted. They probably got you confused with a smarter nipper with the same name, he would joke. But you could see how proud he was. It meant so much to him that one of his grandchildren had managed to get so far academically. He left school when he was 12, he used to tell us, to go apprentice as a riveter in a shipyard. My first year hadn't been too bad. I enjoyed myself, made friends, got drunk, and met girls. My course was good too. The first year hadn't been as hard as I was expecting. But now the second year had kicked in, and the workload was starting to rise. Still, studying history wasn't a hardship for me. I enjoyed it ever since my research into my granddad's medals when I was younger. There was something just captivating about flipping through old dusty tomes hunting for evidence. Like I was some kind of historical detective. The news he had died, it hit me hard. My dad worked long hours at the post office, and my mom was always busy cooking, cleaning, and looking after my sisters. So I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. He used to tell me these long, elaborate bedtime stories about King Arthur, knights, and dragons. He helped my love for nature and my love for history, buying me books about ancient Rome and Egypt. Looking back on it, they must have cost him a pretty big chunk of his pension. The funeral itself was a pretty somber affair. All the family was there. I read a heartfelt eulogy, which everyone said was very moving. But in truth, I just felt empty. I couldn't cry. I couldn't feel anything. It was like my emotions had just shut down. A few months later, I was back at university studying for an essay. I picked up a module on the First World War, partially as a tribute to my granddad, and partially because I had done a lot of reading around it and I thought it would be an easy credit. It wasn't. The professor was a real hard-ass, and with my granddad now passed away, a lot of the pictures and accounts struck closer to home. He lived through this. I remembered thinking as I leafed through a pretty hefty pictorial book of the war. That's when I saw an image that stopped me in my tracks. It was of a soldier being crucified. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. In my mind, I was suddenly back in that room at Christmas with Granddad telling his story. Soldiers hung up on barbed wire as if crucified, and their eyes had been gouged out. I started to feel deeply, deeply uneasy. I was working by the light of a desk lamp, and the shadows of my darkened room began to feel threatening. My eyes darted to the text below. Apparently, an officer in the Canadian Corps was seen by 3 witnesses crucified to a tree with bayonets in April of 2015. But there was no conclusive proof that such a crucifixion had actually occurred. The eyewitnesses' accounts were all somewhat contradictory, and no crucified body was found either. I read further, but the text then went on about British and American propaganda, and there was no mention about the officer's eyes. Perhaps this was just a coincidence, I thought, or just a rumor, or pure propaganda to make the Germans out to be monsters. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the fear in my granddad's eyes as he told us the tale. The darkness in my room felt malevolent as I played the story over and over and over in my head. Over the next few weeks, I pretty much read every book in the library about the First World War, looking for any information about crucified soldiers. I neglected my friends and my coursework. I was completely and utterly single-minded. I needed to find out more. Although I found plenty of references to the crucified Canadian, it was all in the form of propaganda. I couldn't find anything about any other cases. Feeling dejected, I went back to work on my lackluster essay and handed it in. I guess I didn't do very well on the essay at all. It was clear that my heart just wasn't in it. My professor asked me to come in and talk about it. I wasn't very forthcoming with him, and I could tell that he was getting frustrated with me. You're a good historian, but this last essay was very poor. Your references were all over the place and your argument was very weak and full of missed opportunities, he said. I just nodded and mumbled something about not being confident. It's not about confidence, it's about reading the sources, he said. You should have known all this if you did the reading. I did the reading, I retorted. I just got distracted by something else. And then I thought, just screw it. And I told him about the crucified Canadian, and that my granddad had seen something similar. I didn't tell him the full story, though. He went very quiet and just stared at me for a moment, then turned and began digging through some papers on the desk behind him. I waited for a second, and when he didn't say anything, I got up and turned to leave. Kind of annoyed that he dismissed me in such a rude way. "Wait," he said, and I turned around. He had a stack of handwritten papers stapled together in the top left corner. He handed them to me. "Read this," he said, "and I want to see a marked improvement on your next essay." I left, confused, and went back to my student house. Once in my room, I looked at the sheaf of yellowing paper the professor had given me. The first page was in German. I laughed. The old prick was taking the piss on me for not reading the primary sources. And it was obviously his way of saying that I should learn German so I can read both sides. I nearly threw it in the bin. But as I picked it up, I noticed that the back of the page was in English. So I took it to my desk and looked through. I realized it was a transcript of an interview with a German, which had been subsequently translated into English. I began to read, and as I did, a chill ran down my spine. I've copied the English translation below. Interview with Gunter Muller, former officer, 17th Infantry Regiment, regarding a counterattack somewhere in the Somme region, late June 1916. As we charged forward, a shell must have gone off near me. I was stunned and thrown to the ground. I don't know how much time had passed when I came up, but I had dirt in my mouth and my eyes, and a pain in my right leg. The din of battle was still around. I remember the ground shaking with a concussive blast, the chatter of machine guns and the bark of rifle fire. I tried to move, but the pain in my leg was intense. I wiped some of the dirt out of my eyes and looked down. Blood was welling up and stained my field gray trousers in a few places. It didn't look life-threatening, but my leg would spasm with pain any time I tried to move it. I felt exposed and very alone. I couldn't find my helmet, and looking around, my rifle had been shredded by the blast and now looked like kindling. I realized that I had been thrown into the air and into an abandoned trench. Now I was somewhere in the middle of no man's land. I was unarmed and injured. I needed to get back to my own lines, but I was in no fit state to make it back in daylight. There was another man from my unit lying nearby, but he was dead. The interviewer then asked how he knew he was dead. Well, he was missing half of his head. Shrapnel wounds are just horrific. They don't put those pictures in the history books. It's much better to be shot with a bullet than torn up by a shell. I looked around the trench to see if there was somewhere I could hole up until the evening, and either the stretcher bearers found me, or I could crawl back to my own lines. The trench had been shelled heavily, and the wood supporting the sides had been badly broken up. It looked like it was one of ours, too. And despite the destruction, the underlying workmanship was much better than the English or the French trenches. One large piece of corrugated iron had fallen down and was resting on the duckboards in the parapet wall. But from where I was lying, there looked to be darkness behind it. I crawled over to it, dragging my leg behind me, and grabbed the corrugated sheet. To my surprise, it moved easily enough. Behind it was what I had been hoping for, the entrance to a dugout. I hoped that it hadn't been bombed into oblivion by the shelling, and that I could lay there until nightfall. I wish now that I had braved the crawl back to my own lines and never stayed in that godforsaken pit. But in my naivety, I thought it would be safe. I began to crawl under the iron and down the wooden steps. They were intact. The iron sheet must have gave them some protection from the shrapnel. It was pitch black down at the bottom, and despite the warmth on that June day, as I carefully crawled down the steps, the temperature cooled and the air felt damp. I could still feel the earth rumbling from the bombardment, but the sounds of the battle faded away the lower I got. It took my eyes some time to adjust to the dugout. When they did, I nearly jumped out of my damn skin. There was a man sat down in the dark, staring at me. I panicked and immediately raised my hands to show that I was unarmed, but he just sat there, staring. I was sweating and paralyzed with fear. My eyes continued to adjust to the blackness, and I realized with a wave of relief that the man was dead. He must have been that way for a while. His skin was stretched taut over his skull, and he had no eyes. Perhaps the rats had gotten to him. I was quite used to seeing death at this point. I think they call it desensitized. He was sat against a desk, and by the looks of things, this had been an officer's dugout. There were some home comforts that I could make out in the gloom. Even a gramophone was on a table in the corner. I looked around and I could see no other bodies, dead or alive, in there. And I remember it striking me as odd that he was still sat so upright, even in death. I was able to use a table to pull myself up, putting my weight on my good leg. As I did, I felt something on the table and picked it up. It was a Drycy pistol. That was an officer's weapon. Not as common as the Luger, but I had seen one before. I extracted the magazine and saw it was still loaded. So I tucked the gun into my leather belt at the front. I wasn't confident it would fire, but I could at least threaten someone with it. And it made me feel less naked. As I said, I was used to seeing death, but if I was going to be in here for some time, I didn't want that dead officer staring at me all day. So I decided to try and slide him off the chair and into a corner. I gingerly made my way around him using the table to take some weight off of my injured leg. It was just throbbing. I tried to push him off the chair, but although his head lolled, he didn't budge at all. That's when I noticed it. He was bound to the chair with barbed wire. I should have gotten out of there right then, taken my chances with the guns and the shells of no man's land, but I didn't. I think part of me thought that maybe it was just a mutiny or something. They tied up an officer and left him. It seemed callous, but then I'd never served under any truly terrible commanders who would have deserved this or worse. Maybe the shelling had dropped the corrugated iron over the entrance, so no one came down here. Then he starved to death, alone. His dugout becoming his tomb. I pushed harder. This time the chair toppled over, and the corpse hit the floor with a sickening thud. I nearly overbalanced myself as it tipped, and I put some weight on my injured leg and screamed out in pain. I half fell onto what was the officer's cot and laid there for a moment, as the agony coursed through me. The pain eventually subsided. I just laid on the cot thinking of home. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, because I awoke with a start. I lay there, eyes wide, listening intently. The events of that day rushed back to me. Something had woken me up. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up, and I had this enormous feeling of dread inside of me. Some animal instinct was telling me that something was very, very wrong. I wasn't alone. I glanced over at the officer's corpse, but it was still slumped in the corner, bound to the chair. I drew a pistol from my belt and racked the slide. The trace light coming down the stairs was no longer there. I realized I must have slept until dark. The sounds from the battle earlier, the rumbling, everything, had stopped. I got up carefully off the cot, my injured leg protesting as I very carefully set it down. I kept my gun trained on the door, expecting a Tommy to come bursting through at any moment. My senses were overloaded. My hobnails were crunching on the rotten wood of the floor. They seemed as loud as gunshots. I could hear something faintly outside, like movement in the trench above me. My mind was just racing. A patrol, perhaps, investigating this old trench? Were they on my side or theirs? Would they even find me down here? Would they check? Or would they just throw a grenade down first? I was absolutely terrified, but I felt the urge to find out. If they were on my side, maybe they could help me get back to our lines. If they were Tommy's, at least I would know. I could attempt to hide until they moved on. I resolved to carefully make my way up the steps and peek out under the corrugated iron. It was a lot more difficult than I imagined. I was trying to keep the pistol pointed ahead of me, drag my injured leg, and make as little noise as possible. It seemed to take a lifetime. Each time my leg hit a step, it was just agony. Finally, I reached the top of the step and peered out into the darkness. There was someone moving out there. My heart was beating so fast I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. He had his back to me and it seemed like he was bent over, doing something. I couldn't figure out what it was, but it was something wrong though. He didn't look right. It was pretty difficult to read the next bit. It looked like the interviewer was prompting Gunter for more. I don't know how to explain it. I don't think I could quite process what I was seeing. His movements were wrong. His arms were elongated like a chimp's. His head was moving in a strange jerking motion. I must have made a sound, or perhaps it sensed it was being watched because it suddenly stopped and whipped its head around. What I saw, the thing that I saw, was not human. It looked like it may have been at one stage, but the proportions, they were all wrong. Its eyes were too big, its face was sunken, its limbs were too long and too thin. I can't really describe it, but years later, when I read Token, it sounded the same exact way he described Gollum. Exactly. I know he fought for the British on Somme, so maybe he saw it too. Or something like it. I tried not to gasp at all, but I must have made some noise. Its darting, two big eyes stared right at me. Then it moved, unnaturally quickly, in almost a feline-like line towards me. The Dracy pistol barked in my hand, and then the bullet. With more luck than my aim, it hit the chest. It jerked back and let out a blood-curdling scream, the worst one I had ever heard. I can still hear it in my nightmares. The thing turned and scurried on all fours up the parapet out of the trench into no man's land. I was almost paralyzed with fear, and I just stayed still, the gun pointing where it had left the trench. After what seemed like forever, it didn't seem to be coming back, so I moved cautiously out of the trench, and once I did, I could finally see what it was doing. It had been tying up my dead comrade with barbed wire. He was spread eagle over a cross made of two rotting duckboards, his shell-damaged head lolling at a very unnatural angle, his hands pierced with bayonets and his wrists bound by barbed wire. His legs were still loose. I guess I interrupted that thing before it could finish. I had seen a lot of horror in this war, but right then and there, I was absolutely overwhelmed. I vomited. As I looked back at the unnatural hanging head, I noticed something. He was missing half his face from the explosion, but something had changed. Something was different. His remaining eye had been gouged out. I felt a shiver run up my spine at that last line. The rest of the account dealt with his escape from the trench and his journey back to his own lines. There was no further mention of the creature. I put the text down on my bed. My head was spinning. Corroboration of what my granddad had seen. Something taking eyes, a creature living in no man's land. And Token may have seen this one? I had recently reread Lord of the Rings. Perhaps there are more accounts out there. It's been 30 years, and although I found a few other references, hints perhaps that something was out there between the trenches, I've never found anything like the accounts of my granddad and Gunter Muller. And I know my granddad was telling the truth. And I'm still looking now. The Rake. Original author, unknown. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange, human-like creature sparked a brief, local media interest. Before an apparent blackout was enacted, little or no information was left intact, as most of the online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho itself, self-proclaimed witnesses told the stories of their encounters with the creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remained powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating from the 12th century to present day, spanning 4 continents. And in almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group, and I was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book, A Suicide Note, 1964. Quote, "As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have caused through this incident. It is not the fault of anyone other than him, for once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice, and looked in his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake again. Goodbye." Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. "Dearest Lenny, I have just prayed for you. He spoke your name." A journal entry, translated from Spanish, 1880. "I have experienced the greatest horror. I have experienced the greatest horror. I have experienced the greatest horror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierce me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice, then it becomes unintelligible." Miner's Log, 1691. Quote, "He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the Rake." End quote. From a Witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from my trip to Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted and had a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used that moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he had got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the edge of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of bed. Then he grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for a half a second, I could see what caused that strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting, facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large, hairless dog of some sort. Its body was positioned in a disturbing and unnatural way, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, just more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arms and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, then crawled quickly in a sort of flailing motion along the right side until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds. Probably closer to 5, just seemed like a while. Just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway, leading to the kid's room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching, hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped on the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and only spoke once more in her short life. She said, "He is the rake." My husband drove his car into the lake that night, while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They didn't make it. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a bit of an interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local news television station never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I, eventually, located a man in the town next to ours who had a similar story. He got in contact and we began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature, now referred to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving a creature in its first 3 pages. Never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying that they were only told to leave by the Rake, and that was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. So, I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling over in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times normal speed. This still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone else listen to it either. All I know is that I've heard it before, and now I believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I haven't seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he's been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. Real quick side note before we get into today's story. A lot of these old creepypastas don't have an author credited, so if anyone out there has an idea to who the author is, please let me know so I can give them proper credit. That being said, today's story is the Slenderman. Original author, unknown. The Slenderman is an alleged paranormal figure that has been purported to have existed for centuries, covering a large geographical area. Believers in the Slenderman tie his appearance to many other legends around the world, including Verboden, or the Dark Man in Scotland, the Dutch Tucan Man, Branch Man, and the German legend of Der Grossman, the Tall Man. Appearance. The Slenderman is a being, male in appearance, who looks like a man with extremely long, slender arms and legs. He also appears to have 4 to 8 long, black tentacles that protrude from his back, though different photographs and enthusiasts disagree on this fact, and therefore, it's theorized that he can contract these tentacles at will. He is described as wearing a black suit, strikingly similar to the visage of the notorious Men in Black, as the name suggests, appears to be very thin and able to stretch his limbs and torso to inhuman lengths in order to induce fear and ensnare his prey. Once his arms are outstretched, his victims are pulled into a hypnotized state, where they are utterly helpless to stop themselves from walking into them. He is also able to create tendrils from his fingers and back that he uses to walk on a similar fashion to Dr. Octopus. The superhuman stretching ability could be also seen as a similarity between himself and Mr. Fantastic. Whether he absorbs, kills, or merely takes his victims to an undisclosed location or dimension is also unknown, as there are never any bodies or evidence left behind in his wake to induce a definite conclusion. His face is pale and slightly ghostly, and almost appears to have been wrapped in a type of gauze or cloth. His facial features are also an object of debate, and many people believe that his face looks different to each person, if it's seen at all. He sometimes is portrayed as wearing a hat, sometimes a bowler, a fedora, or a top hat. He may also be seen wearing a flowing necktie or scarf, which is either red or gray. He often keeps his long, pale hands crossed politely behind his back or hanging loosely at his side. His suit is black, sometimes portrayed as a pinstripe in artwork, a common misconception thanks to the very similar Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas. He has long coattails which he lets flow proudly. He also wears long dress shoes which are always shined to a perfection, gleaming black. Behavior. Much of the fascination with Slenderman is rooted in the overall aura of the mystery he's wrapped in. Despite the fact that he is rumored to kill children almost exclusively, it's difficult to say whether or not that's the only objective in his slaughter. Oftentimes, it's either reported or recorded that he can be found in sections of the woods, and these generally tend to be suburban. He is also reported to be seen with large groups of children, as many photographs portray. It's commonly thought that he resides in the woods and forest and preys on children. He seems unconcerned with being exposed to daylight or captured in photos. It is often thought that he enjoys stalking people who become very paranoid of his existence, purposely giving them glimpses of himself in order to further frighten them. For this reason, it seems like Slenderman very much enjoys psychologically torturing his victims. He also often appears to float or drift around rather than walk, which may suggest the possibility of him being an ethereal being, rather than a creature or a man. This would also explain why he's able to remain mobile in spite of his poorly proportioned body. Even though Slenderman was fabricated on Something Awful forums, or was he? Some people have already claimed sightings. He is mostly seen at night, peering into open windows, and walks out in front of lone motorists on secluded roads. His main intentions appear to be kidnapping children, as when he's near them in photographs, they usually disappear shortly afterwards. Slenderman has also inspired many stories, such as those of marble hornets. In the end, though, his purposes remain unknown. An interesting take on Slenderman by a Pasta member who was relying on the Marble Hornet series for evidence and facts. Quote, "There seems to be a big misconception about my pal the Slenderman due to the appearance of this article. He does not have hair or a face. Everything else is correct. There are also some questions as to whether or not there are more than one. I find it unlikely. It's most likely Slendy is fucking with your head in order to make you think there are more than one, which he is known to do. As of now, Slendy has 3 to 4 known accomplices. These are Hoodie, Masky, the Rake, and possibly the Observer. Not much is known yet because the next episode of the Noah Maxwell ARG has not yet been released. In the Marble Hornets ARG, Hoodie and Masky are possibly his followers, and in the Everyman Hybrids ARG, the Rake seems to be working with him, but we aren't really sure if that's true or not." End quote. Historical references. And for this section, throughout the rest of the video, there will be pictures on screen for you to take a look at. Brazilian cave paintings. The earliest argued reference to the legend is within the cave paintings found in the Serra de Capivara National Park in the northeast of Brazil, which are believed to date as far back as 9000 BC. These paintings show a strangely elongated character leading children by the hand, but make no reference to extra appendages. Egyptian hieroglyphs. The next known possible reference to the Slenderman comes at around 3100 BC in Lower Egypt, with references to the, quote, thief of the gods, end quote, or the thief of the cuck, end quote. Becoming common during the religion of Pharaoh Wazer, hieroglyphic carvings representing the thief were around the pharaoh's tomb, who was rumored to have some kind of encounter with the entity. The carvings resemble a strange figure with multiple upper limbs, one that has never been found in any other hieroglyph language. German woodcuts. Renowned German woodcutter Hans Frickenberg created at least 2 woodcuts featuring the character described as Der Ritter, the Knight, during the mid-16th century that were discovered in Halstenberg Castle in 1883. Whilst Frickenberg is well known for his realistic depiction of human anatomy, something was unusual among the woodcuts of these pictures featured a skeleton, a multi-limbed character. Historians are unsure of the exact symbolic nature of the character, with some claiming it's the personification of the religious wars that raged on in Europe at the time, while others say it represents the mysterious plagues that have been believed to be the reason for the mysterious abandoning of the Halstenberg Castle in 1543. However, many insist that Frickenberg was attempting to represent Der Grossman, the tall man. According to legend, he was a fairy who lived in the Black Forest. Bad children who crept into the woods at night would be relentlessly chased by Der Grossman, who wouldn't leave them be until he either caught them or they were forced to tell their parents of their wrongdoing. Even then, there is a chilling account of an old journal, dating back from 1702. Quote, "My child Lars, he is gone, taken from his bed. The only thing we found was a scrap of black clothing. It felt like cotton, but it was softer, thicker. Lars came into my bedroom yesterday, screaming at the top of his lungs that the angel was outside. I asked him what he was talking about, and he told me some nonsense about a Der Grossman. He said he went into the groves by our village and found one of the cows dead, hanging from a tree. I thought nothing of this at first, but now he's gone. We must find Lars. My family must leave before we are killed. I'm sorry, my son. I should have listened. May God forgive me." Roman mythology. There's also a Roman fairy tale which tells the legend of a tall man, featuring this description which may have been taken to refer to Slenderman. Quote, "The tall man stood in a clearing, dressed as a nobleman, all in black. Shadows lay over him, dark as cloudy as midnight. He had many arms, all long and boneless as snakes. all sharp as swords. They writhe around like worms on nails. He did not speak, but made his intentions known." End quote. In the fairy tale, the tall man causes a mother to kill her husband and child before he slid from the fireplace and clenched her in his burning embrace. English mythology. There's also English myth referring to the tree man, who is said to have a slim body with appendages that look like tree branches. He is only ever seen in the woods and was used as a story that parents told their children to thwart bad behavior. There have also been quite a few disappearances of children that have been linked to the tree man. I will link this story in the description for you to take a look at as well. Now, here is a slideshow of some pictures that have been attributed to Slenderman. Today's story is a little more visual in nature. So, in order to fully get it, I suggest you actually watch this video rather than just listen to it. Today's narration is The Story of Lisa. Original author, Sonny Schreier. This is Lisa. She's my friend. My mom and dad can't see her, so they said she's an imaginary friend. Lisa is a nice friend. Today, I try to plant a flower in the yard. I try to plant it by the sandbox, but Lisa said that's where her daddy is sleeping, so I planted it in a cup of dirt. Lisa is at school with me today. I brought her for show and tell, but Mrs. Monroe got angry because she couldn't see Lisa. Lisa got sad, so she hit the chalkboard eraser. Yesterday was my birthday party. Mom bought pizza and no one came. Lisa said people came on the porch, then left, but they left presents. I got 3 Barbies, some shoes, and $5. Me and Lisa played Barbies. Mrs. Monroe is absent today. Our substitute is named Mrs. Digman. She's pretty nice and is letting us have snack time after diary time. I wish Miss Digman could stay our teacher. Today, Jonathan Parker stole my pencil sack. Miss Digman couldn't find it, so she made him give me his pencils. Lisa came to school too, but Miss Digman can't see her. But she said she believes that Lisa is real. Yesterday, Lisa and me went on a long walk until the moon came out. Daddy got really mad and said Lisa was stupid and fake. Lisa got sad and disappeared. Today, she didn't come to school, but Miss Digman said Mrs. Monroe won't come back. Daddy was at work all day yesterday. He didn't even come home to eat dinner. Today, he's still at work. Mommy packed me pudding in my lunch today. Pudding is my favorite. I miss Lisa. Daddy is really busy at work. He didn't come home at the weekend. Mom is angry with him. I'm going to write a letter for Lisa. Dear Lisa, I miss you. Please come back. I'm sorry my dad was mean. You are my best friend. Lisa came back yesterday. She said she was sorry for leaving, and I told her my dad won't come home. Lisa said Mrs. Monroe and him are sleeping like her dad. I hope they wake up soon. Tulpa. Original author? Unknown. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local newspaper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money. Since it was the only ad that week that I knew I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me all I had to do was stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity. While I was there, I would visualize a double for myself. They called it my tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would get paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me into a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my heads and hooked them up to a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again, and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around, or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had some trouble with it the first few days. It was more controlled than sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the 4th day, I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The second week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the tulpa with me, even with distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a bit more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music. Only this time, it was punctuated with shrieks and feedback loops, and what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, not to mention guttural speaking voices some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I would start interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations, play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling or breakdancing or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged it. So, we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. And then it just started getting strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was the green one. I thought about it for a second, and then I realized he was right. It creeped me out. After my shift that day, I talked to one of the researchers about it. You're using a thought form to access your subconscious, they explained. You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had been creepy was suddenly really cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found out that I could question my tulpa and access all different kinds of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books that I read once, years before, or things that I was taught and then immediately forgot when I was in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it seemed almost odd to not have him around. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually, I just started doing it all the time. It was amusing to take him along, like an invisible friend almost. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends, visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak out loud to him, so I was able to carry on a conversation with him and nobody would have ever known. I know it sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I'd forgotten, he also seemed to be more in touch with me than I did sometimes. He had an uncanny grasp of the minute body language that even I didn't realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I brought him on was going not so well, but he pointed out that she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes, leaning in as she spoke to me, and a bunch of other subtle clues that I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and, well, let's just say the date went very, very well. By this time, I've been with the research center for about 4 months. He was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that. He just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves. While I had a manifestation of myself to confer with, it made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions, why some things made them mad and other things made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did. Or at least, I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend of mine confronted me one evening. He pounded at the door until I answered, and came in fuming, swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in weeks, you fucking dick," he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him, and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my tulpa suddenly grew furious. "Hit him," it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and then came up swinging. We beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I have ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and then he fled, hunched over and crying. The police were at my apartment a few minutes later. I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they just let me off with a warning. My tulpa was gritting the entire time. I spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I had beaten a friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I've been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course. He knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me. I felt my skin crawl. I explained all of this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood behind him, nodding his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over and over for the next few days, I found myself growing more and more anxious around my tulpa. And it looked like he was changing. He looked taller, more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. I finally decided that no job was worth losing my mind over. If he was out of control, I'd have to put him down. I was so used to visualizing him at this point that it was basically an automatic process. So I would try my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to somewhat work. I could get rid of him for hours at a time. But every time, he would come back. And he seemed even worse. His skin seemed ashen. His teeth were more pointed than before. He would hiss and sneer. He would threaten and swear. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months also seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was at home, I would relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him. And there he would be, and that fucking howling music with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was actively not visualizing my tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressive men grabbed me and restrained me. Someone in a lab coat stabbed a hypodermic needle into my body. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, this time strapped to my bed, music blaring. My doppelganger standing over me, cackling. He didn't even look human anymore. His features were twisted. His eyes were sunken into the sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much, much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted and the fingernails looked like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't. I couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV on my arm. I thrashed at my restraints the best I could, but I couldn't move at all.
They're pumping you full of the good shit, I think. How's the mind? All fuzzy?
He leaned closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like rotten meat. I tried to focus, but I just couldn't banish him. The next 2 weeks were just terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come inject me with something or force feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes just left me hallucinating or straight up delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking me. He either interacted with or caused my delusions. I even hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me. And then he cut her throat and showered me in her blood. It was so real, I could almost taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at time, screamed, even hurled invectives, demanded answers. They never spoke to me. They may have talked to my tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped up and confused. It may have been more than a delusion, but I remember them talking to him. I grew convinced he was the real one, and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought sometimes, and mocked me at others. Another thing that I would just pray was a delusion was he could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He would poke and prod at me if he felt that I wasn't giving him enough attention. One day, he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearms with one of his talons. I still have the scar. Most days, I can convince myself that I just injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then, one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was gonna gut everyone I ever loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A pouty look crossed his face, and then he reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment, and then smiled.
All of the thoughts are creative,
he told me. Then he just walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and then passed out. I woke up unrestrained, shaking. I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into an empty hallway, and then I just ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out to the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew that I had to keep moving, but I just couldn't manage it. I did get home eventually. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser in front of it. Took a long shower, and I slept for about a day and a half. Nobody came for me that night. Nobody came the next day, or the one after that. It was finally over. I spent a week locked in that room, but it felt like a century. I had withdrawn so much from my life before that no one even knew that I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart, and the names that I'd been given were aliases. Even the money I received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as anyone can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration that those fucking bastards taught me to convince myself. It works, sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister is the latest victim in this spree of killings. The police say the perpetrator mugs his victim and then guts him. The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely a service as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff. It sounded like feedback and shrieking. Maybe a modem dialing up. I still hear it, only a little bit louder now. What do you like about playing under the bed? By Crazy Ninja. It all started when I was around 9 or 10 years old. Actually, it may have been earlier. But that's around the first memory I have of it. See, I've had sleep paralysis for as long as I can remember. Although it's rare now that I'm an adult. Most people that I've told about this have assumed I'm just scared of the dark, or I've had bad nightmares. But that's not it. Although I am, and I do. But that's not it. I've always had very, very vivid dreams. When I was dreaming, I was there. I could see, smell, hear, and feel everything. I was also very adept to lucid dreaming, having a choice to affect my dreams at will. That didn't work on nightmares, though. I often had nightmares before these episodes. Horribly, horribly vivid nightmares. Almost every night. Dreams of falling, fire, death, being alone in an empty space. But mostly monsters. And those were the worst. Some of them were your classic 80s slasher icons, Jason, Freddy, etc. You know, come to think of it, I think my mom let me watch those movies a little too young, along with reading Stephen King. But she's still my hero. Those dreams usually involved running and hiding while being in a strange place. Usually some creepy abandoned building or out in the woods. The monsters that didn't come from the movies were always the worst. Dreams come from your subconscious, supposedly. So I guess somehow my mind created them. Although, as a child, it seemed like they were from the depths of hell. Twisted, grotesque things, sometimes vaguely resembling a human form, with missing limbs or too many. Hideous faces with skin missing or eyes hanging out of sockets. Some of them weren't even human at all. Giant creatures with wings and razor-sharp claws and teeth. black shadows with red eyes that would just stand in the corner while I watched TV or did mundane tasks like homework. Sometimes, I would wake up before they got me though, but not always. People say you're not supposed to die in dreams, but I have many, many times. I've fallen and hit the ground, I've burned up in a fire, I've been stabbed and sliced. I even had a dream that I was at a funeral that turned out to be mine. I stayed up for the rest of the night after that one. Well, I'm not really scared of the dark, per se, or even scared of my nightmares. I am afraid of waking up in the dark. Let me explain what a typical night was for me when I was younger, and maybe you can start to understand too. I would fall asleep in my bedroom with the TV on, mostly for the light. Sound would just be loud enough for me to make out what they were saying. Sometimes I would fall asleep on the couch with the light and sound coming from my parents' bedroom before I had a TV in my room. Then, the dream would start. The worst one ever, which I had often. I don't know how rare reoccurring dreams are, but I feel like I got more than my fair share. It would start with me waking up in my own bed. I would be viewing it as though it was from my own eyes, rather than from the third person, as a lot of my dreams were. I would look at my alarm clock and it would say 3:33 a.m. Always. That's when the fear would start. I knew what was coming, but was powerless to prevent it. I would slowly start to place my feet on the floor and stand up while stretching and yawning. I'd start to head for the bathroom. Not sure how I knew the bathroom was my destination, as I never made it there. And I would trip on something. I would crash to the floor, hitting my nightstand and causing my alarm clock to fall on my head and then bounce. So I'm laying there, cursing at myself, and looking under the bed. There was nothing there. And I mean, nothing. The meager light in my room should penetrate at least a few inches into the darkness, but it's like a wall of black shadow, a completely empty void. And then I freeze with fear. Suddenly, 2 small blue orbs of fire would appear, directly eye level with me. They were the eyes of some sort of being staring into my soul. Its breath was the worst part. I could see it and smell it at the same time. I only knew it was breathing because it came out like a fog. Like when you're outside in the wintertime, only it wasn't even cold in my room. And the breath upon my face was cold enough to chill me to the bone. And the stench. Ugh. It was as if someone took a dead animal carcass and dirty diapers and lit them on fire with 1,000 matches, like sulfurs and burnt hair and shit. My mind would be screaming, "Run! Hide!" But my body was completely frozen. I was hyper aware. I can feel every muscle in my body tense up in preparation. But nothing. Nothing happens. Then, it grabs me. I can see nothing, no limbs of any sort. But I'm being dragged under the bed. Then, I'm in total blackness. I can feel its disgusting breath on my neck and I can hear my own heartbeat. But my sense of sight is totally gone. I don't feel arms around me specifically, but I'm definitely being held there. It feels like someone has wrapped a blanket made of flesh around me. But it's stronger than I am and holds me completely still. Then, I feel its tongue slowly lick from my neck to my ear, as though it was tasting my fear. In a voice I can only describe as broken glass soaked in blood, gravelly and grating and wet, it would whisper,
"What do you like about playing under the bed?"
And then that was when I would snap out of it. I struggle, fight, swinging my elbows and kicking my legs as hard as I can. Eventually, I would loosen the creature's grip, and I would wake up. Now, this is where the real fun begins. I would be completely frozen, sometimes to the point where I couldn't even open my eyes. Sometimes that would be all I could do. Just frozen for a minute or two, then I would snap out of it. I'm getting a little freaked out even just writing about it. The memories are that vivid as it comes out. Other times, the nightmares followed me. I remember once I was lying there frozen, trying to force my eyes to close when I heard that same thick, gravelly voice say,
"Come back under the bed. The games were just starting."
I couldn't even turn my head to look towards the sound. Not sure I would have, even if I could. But I could feel its cold breath on my ear. I guess I must have screamed because my mom ran into the room and turned on the light. I swear to God, I saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye melt into the floor, heading back under the bed. She checked to reassure me that there was nothing there, but I still didn't know what to believe. According to the therapists and counselors I've talked to since I was little, I was experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations, common to sleep paralysis. They don't know how real it was, though. When I would wake up in my bed and once I was able to move again, I would jump off the bed, making sure to stay well away from the edge, and run to my parents' room, and crawl into bed with them. Sadly, I would do this until I was 14. Oftentimes, though, I wouldn't wake up in my bed where I fell asleep. Sometimes, after that specific dream, I would wake up on the floor next to my bed, which was even worse, especially if the paralysis kicked in, which was often. I've woken up on the couch, on the floor of my parents' room, on the kitchen floor in an empty bathtub, once even on the porch. On the occasions I would find scratches and cuts on my body. Although often small, one time I had a 6-inch gouge across my ribcage. I still have the scar. The therapist said this was due to sleepwalking and running into things. My grandmother had a very different view of things. I loved my grandma, but she definitely wasn't your regular sweet old lady. My grandma had a deep appreciation for the cult. When I told her about my dreams, she would put a cross over herself and did that weird little evil eye hand gesture. I asked why she was freaking out. "My dear, 3:33 is the time of evil," she explained. 3 is a number of Satan. 3 a.m. is the witching hour, dear, when the veil between the realms is thin and reality can be easily warped. It was more likely that it was an actual demon trying to drag you into the underworld. You're lucky to have survived the attacks. She also told me that I wasn't sleepwalking, as the therapist suggested. But actually, I guess you could say an alternate plane or dimension, or even the underworld. We always thought she was a little crazy, but now I'm not so sure. I wish she was still alive to help me and my family. Recently, my 7-year-old son has been waking up in the middle of the night, around 3:30 a.m. He's been screaming about a monster with blue eyes. I was holding him after one recent episode, telling him that it was a dream and he'll be okay. He kept repeating the word no. When I would get him to calm down a little, I asked why he was saying no. He said he didn't want to play under the bed.